You've been told that sleep is just rest, that it's just something your body needs to keep going. But what if sleep could be something more? What if it could be a doorway, not just to dreams, but to truth? Every night you close your eyes, but your mind keeps running. Thoughts spinning, regrets whispering, worries clinging to you like a second skin. You scroll, you breathe, you try. But the peace never quite arrives. They told you peace comes from slowing down, from meditation apps, from lavender sprays and sound baths. But if that worked, why are you still tired even after 8 hours? Why does your soul feel heavy even when your eyes are closed? The truth is, you're not just sleep deprived, you're meaning deprived. You don't just need rest, you need release. You need a space where your spirit can breathe again. That's what this is. For the next 3 hours, you're going to be guided not just into sleep, but into something much deeper, spiritual stillness. Not religion, not dogma, just timeless wisdom, gentle truths passed down for centuries to help people like you find freedom from suffering. Teachings from monks, sages, and awakened minds who learned how to be free even when life wasn't easy, even when the mind was loud, even when the heart was broken. Tonight, you'll feel something shift. The noise will soften, your breath will deepen, your soul will feel held. You won't just fall asleep, you'll drift into clarity, into calm, into something real. This isn't just another sleep audio. This is a quiet revolution inside you. Are you ready? Let's begin. Before we begin, take a slow breath. Not because it's a ritual, but because it's the first thing you've done all day without rushing. Because something inside you is already loosening like tension that's been waiting years to be exhaled. What you're about to hear won't just help you sleep. It might help you wake up, not in the morning, but in your life. Let's go deeper now into one of the most powerful truths ever discovered by the human mind. A truth so misunderstood, it often gets dismissed as cold, confusing, or worse, irrelevant. But tonight, under the stillness of sleep, you'll begin to see it clearly, and it just might change the way you hold your entire life. This is the science of shunyata, the wisdom of emptiness. At first, the word sounds distant, strange, like a spiritual theory locked away in temples and old books. But shunyata isn't just philosophy. It's not something to memorize or debate. It's something you feel in your bones when the masks fall off, when silence stretches longer than your thoughts, when life reminds you that everything you cling to, your identity, your beliefs, even your pain, was never as solid as it seemed. Emptiness isn't the absence of life. It's the space that makes life possible. Think of this. A cup holds tea not because of its clay, but because of the space inside it. A window lets in light not because of the glass, but because of the empty space the glass frames. Emptiness, in the deepest Buddhist sense, doesn't mean nothingness. It means that nothing exists independently. Everything arises in connection, dependent, intertwined. That thought alone unravels so much of what we've been taught to believe, that we are fixed, that others are unchangeable, that our emotions define us, that our past chains us. But the truth of shunyata says otherwise. It reveals a softer, more flexible view of existence, one where the self isn't a hard object, but a process, a pattern, a river, not a rock. Most suffering comes from forgetting this. Think about the last time you felt hurt. Maybe someone rejected you. Maybe life didn't unfold the way you planned. There's a natural tendency to contract, to solidify your sense of self. I'm not good enough. They're always like this. This is just who I am. But emptiness gently reminds us, none of that is fixed. Those thoughts are not the truth. They're clouds, not the sky. They come, they go, they change shape depending on the weather of your mind. When you understand this, not just in your head, but in your heart, your relationship to pain transforms. Instead of resisting it, defining yourself by it, or escaping it, you start to see through it. And what's revealed on the other side is space, choice, peace. This is why shunyata is not just spiritual theory, it's spiritual freedom. The self that seems so real, so permanentis, made up of parts, sensations, thoughts, reactions, conditioning, all moving, all changing. And yet we grasp at it like it's a stone statue. This is who I am. This is what I need. This is what I deserve. But the more tightly we cling, the more life feels like a war. What if you could let go of the fight? Not by becoming passive, not by abandoning responsibility, but by loosening the grip on the story of me. You would still care, still feel, still love. But you'd stop bleeding from every little wound, because you'd stop believing every little thought. When shunyata is realized, not just thought about, you begin to feel less like a person trapped inside a mind, and more like an open field where thoughts come and go. You stop identifying with every fear, every craving, every opinion. You stop defining yourself by what you like, dislike, defend, or desire. This doesn't make you cold, it makes you kind. Because when you stop obsessing over protecting the illusion of a solid self, you become more available to others, to presence, to compassion. So much of what breaks relationships isn't just disagreement, it's the clashing of rigid selves. You always do this. I'm not the kind of person who... These are not just sentences, they're prisons. But when you see how empty your identity really is, not meaningless, but fluid, you become easier to be with, less reactive, less trapped by I and you, and more rooted in we. Emptiness gives relationships room to breathe. When someone hurts you, you can pause before hardening into blame. You can ask, what are they reacting to? What part of me is feeling this pain? Not to excuse anything, but to understand it's all patterns. Nothing fixed, nothing that can't be seen clearly. And in that clarity, sometimes forgiveness grows not as a choice, but as a natural outcome of seeing things as they are. And if you don't forgive, that's okay too. Emptiness doesn't demand sainthood, it only invites honesty. The kind of honesty that says, this pain is here, but it's not who I am. That's already a kind of liberation. One of the greatest misunderstandings in spirituality is that emptiness means disconnection, that if everything is empty, nothing matters. But shunyata reveals the opposite. Because things are empty, they're full of possibility. Because nothing is fixed, everything can change. Because nothing stands alone, everything is connected. Your sadness is connected to a memory. That memory is connected to a face. That face is connected to a story. That story was shaped by culture. That culture was shaped by ancestors. That ancestry, all the way back, touches every human being who ever lived. One thread, pulled gently, vibrates the whole web. In that web, nothing is random, nothing is separate, and nothing stays. Which brings us to the tender part of emptiness, the part that makes some people afraid. The truth that everything changes, everyone leaves, everything ends. But think about this. What if that's not a reason to suffer, but a reason to love more deeply? What if impermanence is the very thing that gives life its urgency, its beauty, its presence? If we were frozen in time, if people never died, if nothing ever shifted, would we still care the same way? Would we cherish moments, hold hands longer, listen better? It's the truth of emptiness that reminds you to pay attention, to stop waiting for the perfect life before you start enjoying the one you have, to stop clinging to fixed identities. I'm always anxious. I'm bad at relationships. I can't change, and start noticing the tiny openings that show up each day, a moment of silence, a breath that feels different, a decision that surprises you. You don't need to believe in emptiness. You already live in it. Every time a thought disappears, every time a mood passes, every time you laugh when you expected to cry, or feel peace when you expected pain. Those moments are cracks in the illusion, and the more you notice them, the more they widen. Until one day, something breaks open and, instead of trying to put the pieces back together, you realize, maybe the breaking was the point. Maybe there's nothing to glue back. Maybe there never was a fixed you, to begin with just the dance of awareness playing in the field of form. That's the gift of shunyata. It doesn't promise that life will be easy. It doesn't guarantee that you won't suffer. But it shows you how to suffer differently, how to suffer lightly, how to stop adding pain to pain by believing that suffering defines you. With this understanding, pain becomes part of the story, not the author. Thoughts lose their grip. Emotions still rise, but they pass through you like waves through open water. The shore is no longer needed. You float. You let go. Not to escape, but to return. Return to the quiet underneath the noise, to the peace that was never missing, only hidden. Hidden by the stories you believed, the identities you built, the masks you wore because you thought that's what life demanded. But life never demanded that. Life only asked one thing: be present. And shunyata helps you do just that. Not by giving you more tools, more strategies, more self-help ideas, but by stripping away what you never needed. By gently peeling back the layers of illusion until what's left is this. This breath, this silence, this presence. The more deeply you understand emptiness, the more free you become from comparison. You stop measuring your worth in likes, in jobs, in status, because there's no solid self to compare. You are a moment, an unfolding, a fluid intelligence moving through form, and that makes you unshakable, no because you never fall, but because nothing in you stays stuck. This is why great teachers didn't just talk about emptiness, they embodied it. They moved through life with grace, because they didn't cling. They could love fully, because they didn't need guarantees. They could speak truthfully, because they had nothing to protect. That's not something reserved for saints. That's a possibility for you. Even now, as you listen, some part of you knows this already. You've felt it before in moments of stillness, in grief so deep it stripped you bare, in joy so pure it silenced thought. Those were moments of shunyata, not as theory, as truth. And now you're remembering. Not learning something new, but seeing clearly what was always here, underneath the noise, underneath the fear, underneath the identity. What's here is not emptiness as a void, but emptiness as space, as openness, as freedom. Freedom to let go of who you think you need to be. Freedom to feel everything without drowning in any of it. Freedom to stop chasing peace and start resting in it. You don't need to do anything to reach it. You're already here. So you've come this far into the quiet, into the space beyond stories, beyond solid ground. The mind begins to loosen, the breath deepens, and something inside starts to release its grip. There is a calm here, not because everything is figured out, but because you no longer need it to be. But here's where the mind asks its next question. If the self is not solid, not permanent, then what carries on? What continues after death? What is reborn if there is no one here to begin with? This isn't a puzzle to be solved by logic. It's a truth that needs to be felt like light under your skin, not to explain away your fears, but to help you see through them. The teachings on rebirth and no self don't contradict each other. They illuminate each other, but only when we drop the habit of seeing things as black or white. Rebirth without self is not about a soul traveling body to body. It's not about an identity moving through time like a passenger. It's subtler, more intricate, and far more liberating. The self, as we normally think of it, is an illusion created by habit, by memory, by clinging. It's not that nothing exists at all, it's that what exists isn't what you think. There's no solid I that stays the same from moment to moment. Instead, there is a chain of causes and conditions, a process, like a flame passed from candle to candle. The flame continues, but there's no original fire hiding behind it all. The mind resists this. It wants something to hold, something permanent to lean on. But what if that craving is the very source of your suffering? What if the fear of losing the self is the only thing keeping you from freedom? Rebirth is not a restart button for your personality. It's not an eternal replay of your name, your preferences, your attachments. It's a continuation of tendencies, of intentions, of causes that have not yet finished unfolding. It's a stream, not a statue. And in that stream, identity keeps forming again and again, not because something is carrying it, but because conditions allow it. Think of it this way. A thought arises in your mind. Then it passes. Another takes its place. Is it the same thought? No. But is it connected? Yes. They arise out of the same conditions, the same fuel. That's how rebirth works. The next life isn't yours in the way your mind wants to believe, but it is part of a vast continuity of karma, of unfolding processes. This isn't about believing in a metaphysical afterlife. It's about understanding how even now the illusion of continuity creates a sense of self. Your personality, your likes, your fears, they are recreated moment by moment, held together by craving, by aversion, by identification. And just like a story, they need a reader. The reader is awareness, but the character being read, the you that you think you are, is fiction, not fake, just not fixed. When you see this, you begin to relate differently to fear, especially the fear of death. Because death no longer looks like the end of me. It looks like the natural pause in a process, the releasing of one pattern so another can arise, not as punishment, not as reward, just as the natural unfolding of karma. Karma is not fate. It's not cosmic justice. It's cause and effect. If you plant an apple seed, you don't get an orange tree. But also, the seed doesn't guarantee the tree will thrive. The soil matters. The weather matters. The tending matters. In the same way, your thoughts, your actions, your speech, they plant seeds. But whether they grow, how they grow, what they grow, into that depends on the conditions, not all of which you control, but none of which are random. This is where personal responsibility becomes powerful, not because you can control everything, but because your intention deeply matters. The mental quality with which you act becomes part of the pattern that continues, even if you don't. And so, rebirth isn't something to fear or long for. It's a mirror. It shows you what you are nurturing right now. Are your thoughts planting peace or resentment? Are your actions fueled by compassion or by fear? These aren't just philosophical questions. They're instructions for liberation. If the self isn't solid, then neither is your pain. If identity is conditioned, then so is your trauma. That doesn't mean it's imaginary. It means it's workable. When you stop asking, "Why am I like this?" and start seeing, what are the conditions that gave rise to this? You stop being trapped in shame and start walking the path of freedom. This also changes how you relate to others. If they are not fixed selves, but flowing conditions, then judgment softens. You stop needing to define people by their worst moments. You begin to see the karmic momentum behind their behavior, not to excuse it, but to understand it. And in understanding, compassion arises not as a virtue, but as a natural response to truth. The paradox of no self and rebirth breaks down only if you cling to either extreme. If you think there's a soul, you grasp. If you think there's nothing, you despair. But if you see there's a process changing, dependent, alive, you relax. You become part of the flow. And here's something tender. Even though there's no permanent you, your actions still matter. Not because they define you, but because they shape the future. Your kindness matters. Your courage matters. Even the smallest act of presence becomes part of what continues. You may not see its full impact, but you don't need to. You only need to trust the field you're planting into. This understanding also reframes grief. When someone dies, we mourn their absence. But if we deeply understand no self, we start to notice they were never just that body, never just that name. What they gave, how they lived, the love they shared, those things don't vanish. They ripple outward. They become part of what shapes others. And if you've ever lost someone and felt their presence long after, you know what this means. Not in theory, in your bones. You know they continue, not in the way your mind expected, but in a way that feels more real than memory, less graspable, more eternal. Understanding rebirth without self also frees you from the pressure to be somebody. You stop trying to build a legacy, to preserve your name, to win immortality through achievement. Instead, you start focusing on the quality of your presence, on what you're putting into the world with your thoughts, your actions, your care. And strangely, that's what gives your life meaning. Not permanence, but participation. You are not a fixed point in time. You are a part of time unfolding. Your choices shape the unfolding, not because you own it, but because you're connected to it. This truth dissolves ego not through denial, but through understanding. Ego is not evil. It's just a habit of holding on, a way of freezing the flow so we can feel in control. But when you see through that, when you relax the need to solidify, ego becomes transparent. You still function, you still live, but you're no longer trapped in the costume of me. That's where real freedom begins. It's not found in trying to fix the self or escape the self, but in seeing clearly that the self is never what it appears to be. In that seeing, fear drops, desire calms, awareness opens. And what's left is not emptiness in the scary sense, but space, spaciousness, peace. The more deeply you realize there's no fixed self, the less reactive you become. Someone insults you, and there's nothing to defend. Someone praises you, and there's nothing to inflate. You become light not because you're passive, but because you're not stuck. And from that lightness, love flows. Not possessive love, not needy love, but a spacious love that sees clearly and still cares deeply. Because love, in the absence of ego, becomes unconditional. It becomes service. It becomes freedom for both you and the other. When there's no one to defend, there's no one to protect. You stop living behind walls. You let life in, fully. And in letting it in, you dissolve into something wider than self, something ancient, something sacred. And in the quiet of night, when thought fades and presence remains, you begin to sense it, not as an idea, but as truth. You are not your story. You are the space the story appears in. You are not the flame. You are the heat it leaves behind. You are not the one who is reborn. You are the pattern unfolding. And in this pattern, there is freedom, not from life, but from delusion. Not from pain, but from ownership of pain. Not from death, but from fear of death. This is the paradox, and this is the path. And now that the illusion of a fixed self has softened, something else becomes clear, almost uncomfortably so. Even without a solid identity, life continues to unfold. Actions keep happening. Words get spoken. Thoughts rise, often before we know where they came from. Something is still shaping your path, moment by moment. But what is it? This is where the deeper layer of karma, begins to reveal itself not as punishment or reward, but as movement, as energy shaped not just by what you do, but by why you do it. Not just by the action, but by the spark behind it. And this spark has a name: intention. It's not the size of your act that defines your karma. It's the quality of your heart when you act. In the teachings of the Buddha, this is called cetanathe volition, the mental direction that leads to action. And this, more than anything, is what builds your future. So many people think karma is about doing good things to get good results. Be kind, and the universe will reward you. Be selfish, and you'll pay the price. But this turns karma into a vending machine, as if the cosmos were keeping score. The deeper truth is far more subtle and far more powerful. Karma is not about outcomes, it's about conditioning. Every thought you nurture shapes your mind. Every intention you repeat becomes easier to repeat again. Like carving a path in soft earth, your thoughts create mental grooves. These grooves become habits. Habits become tendencies. Tendencies become character. And character creates your world. So when people say it's just a thought, they don't realize that thought is the seed. Before any word is spoken, before any choice is made, there is a mental motion. And this motion, when rooted in craving, fear, or delusion, begins to shape suffering. When it's rooted in clarity, generosity, or compassion, it leads toward peace. That's why mastering intention is the beginning of mastering your life. But here's the challenge. Most intentions are unconscious. They happen so fast, you barely notice them. You say something hurtful, then realize later it wasn't about the person, it was about your own wound. You make a choice, only to discover it came from fear, not freedom. But the damage, or the benefit, is already set in motion. This is where mindfulness becomes essential, not just awareness of breath or body, but awareness of why you do what you do. That small pause before speaking, that moment of checking in before acting, becomes the gateway to karmic clarity. It's not always comfortable. Seeing your own motives clearly can feel like turning on a harsh light. But it's also the beginning of wisdom, because when you start watching intention, you begin to interrupt the cycle. You notice that your helpful act might be driven by the need to be liked, that your silence might come from resentment, not peace, that your generosity might be tangled with pride, and you begin to ask, not what did I do, but what was I really trying to create? This shift is what changes everything. Once you understand that intention shapes your inner world, you become less obsessed with controlling outer results. You realize you could do the right thing for the wrong reason and still suffer, or fail on the outside but grow on the inside because your heart was clear. It's not about looking good, it's about being aligned. And this kind of alignment becomes powerful. It's not dramatic, it doesn't always look heroic, but it creates peace that isn't dependent on applause. It builds a kind of quiet strength, the kind you carry even when no one sees it, even when everything else falls away. This is also why thoughts of anger, jealousy, or greed matter even if you don't act on them, because they still shape you. They leave traces, not because the universe punishes you for thinking them, but because your mind becomes what it repeatedly feeds on. Even subtle forms of manipulation, superiority, or control left unchecked become a field in which future suffering can grow. But this isn't about guilt, it's about choice. Every moment is a chance to plant different seeds, to redirect intention, to bring light into the corners of your mind that operate out of habit. And the most powerful transformation comes not when you suppress those habits, but when you see them clearly and meet them with wisdom. When anger rises, you can acknowledge it, trace its roots, and choose not to act from it. That moment of awareness plants a different karma, not through force, but through insight. And insight grows when you stay curious. Why do you want what you want? Why do you fear what you fear? What do you think you'll gain by proving you're right? What are you really protecting when you criticize others? These are not questions to shame yourself. They are mirrors, and they become windows when you're ready to look through them. In this light, karma stops being something external and becomes something deeply personal, not personal as in egocentric, but personal as in intimate. It's not about fate handed down from the past. It's about the unfolding of your present mental landscape. Every resentment held, every kindness offered, every fantasy entertained, these shape the architecture of your inner world. And the more you tune into intention, the more refined your awareness becomes. You begin to detect subtleties, how anxiety dresses itself as planning, how control wears the mask of care, how ego can pretend to be helpful, and instead of pushing these aside, you become gentle with them. You learn to sit with your motives, question them, and choose again. Because you always can. That's the hidden power. You can choose to listen instead of react, to soften instead of harden, to release instead of resist. These small shifts in thought begin to generate a new karmic field. And slowly, the mind starts trusting itself again. It becomes less divided, less noisy, more whole. You start to notice something even deeper, that even positive intentions can be laced with craving, that wanting peace can turn into grasping for stillness, that chasing virtue can become a disguised form of self-judgment. And in those moments, you see the last layer, the attachment to being a certain kind of person. Here's the freedom. Even the desire to be good can be let go of. Because when intention becomes pure, it doesn't come from identity, it comes from understanding. You don't help someone because you're a helper. You help because suffering is real and compassion is a natural response. You don't meditate because you're a spiritual person. You meditate because clarity matters. You don't speak kindly because you want approval. You speak kindly because harshness hurts both the one who receives it and the one who delivers it. This is karma purified not as strategy, but as expression. It's not something to achieve, it's something to return to. A natural alignment with what is true, with what doesn't create harm, with what brings the mind home to itself. And from this place, even difficult emotions begin to transform. Fear becomes care, anger becomes energy, grief becomes tenderness. These aren't mistakes, they are raw materials. And intention is the alchemy. Because when you bring attention to intention, you create a subtle shift in direction. You don't need to leap forward, you only need to turn 1 degree, and that 1 degree over time changes the entire path. Even if no one sees it, even if nothing on the outside looks different, inside, something is realigning, something is waking up. This is why the teachings don't start with changing behavior. They start with watching the mind. Because when the mind is clear, action follows. And when action follows a heart that's unclenched, the karmic imprint is clean. It leaves no residue, nothing sticky, nothing that returns to haunt you. You sleep better, you speak more gently, you carry less regret. And over time, the noise inside gets quieter, not because you've silenced it by force, but because it no longer has fuel. This is not perfection, it's presence. It's paying attention to how your thoughts move and choosing which ones you give energy to. When you start to see how thought shapes intention and intention shapes karma, you stop looking outside for answers. You stop waiting for life to change. You realize you are the Chanjano because of willpower, but because of awareness. And this awareness becomes the beginning of awakening. Not dramatic, not loud, just a simple knowing. What I think matters, what I intend matters. What I nurture inside becomes the life I live outside. And so the mind becomes your path, not as something to conquer, but as something to care for. And once you start paying attention to the quiet forces within you, your thoughts, your intentions, you start noticing something else. Words begin to feel heavier. They no longer pass through unnoticed. They carry weight, shape, energy, and echo far beyond the moment they're spoken. But there's something deeper than speaking, deeper even than thinking. Something beneath language, beneath reaction, beneath the noise. It's not emptiness in the way people think of void or absence. It's not just being quiet. It's a kind of stillness that communicates more than words ever could, a space that holds more truth than explanation. This is where noble silence begins, not as withdrawal, but as deep engagement, not as the absence of voice, but the presence of clarity. In many Buddhist traditions, silence is not simply a practice. It is a method for transformation. It doesn't mean muting yourself. It means refining the field through which insight arises. Because when the mouth is still, the mind is easier to hear. When the outer noise settles, the inner truth has a chance to surface. Speech, by its very nature, moves outward. It forms identities. It shapes relationships. It influences the world. But too often, words are used to escape, not to connect, to fill silence out of discomfort, to prove something, to protect ego. The deeper the craving to be understood, the more we tend to speak from fear rather than insight. But the moment we stop trying to explain, the truth starts to speak for itself without needing our help. This is what noble silence protects. It creates a boundary around awareness, a soft container where clarity can grow. Not because everything becomes known, but because everything is allowed to be seen without interruption. In this silence, there's no pressure to impress, no urge to control, no compulsion to narrate. Instead, there's a loosening, a melting of mental tension. At first, it can feel unfamiliar, even painful. The silence feels loud. The mind becomes restless. Thoughts grow sharper. But that discomfort is not a problem. It's the noise inside becoming visible. That's the first stage of purification. Not silence from peace, but silence through friction. What comes up isn't a mistake. It's material. It's what was always there. Noble silence doesn't hide it. It reveals it. And this revelation is crucial, because as long as we speak to distract ourselves, we never truly meet ourselves. When you're in silence, there's no one to validate your opinion, no conversation to reinforce your role. The ego doesn't get fed in the usual ways, and so it starts to shrink, not out of suppression, but out of irrelevance. This is why noble silence is not passive. It's fiercely alive. It holds everything, every thought, every emotion, every sensation. It doesn't reject or grasp. It simply watches. And in that watching, something begins to reorganize. The mind, when not pulled outward by speech, starts to settle inward. Attention sharpens. Patterns appear. You begin to see not just what you think, but why you think it. Not just what you feel, but the root of that feeling. In this space, communication shifts, not toward absence, but toward refinement. Insight becomes more intuitive. Awareness expands without effort. A different kind of dialogue begins soon that doesn't need mouths, only presence. Many advanced teachers speak of insight transmission that happens in silence. Students sit with them, and something gets passed not through words, but through energy, through being, through alignment. This isn't mystical fluff, it's a real phenomenon. When the mind is quiet, it becomes more receptive. It syncs with deeper frequencies of awareness. Like two instruments tuning to the same note, understanding flows without language. But this kind of silence requires intention, not just not talking, but choosing to stay inwardly still, It requires restraint not of emotion, but of reactivity. It's not silence as retreat. It's silence as engagement without interference. A willingness to let things be revealed on their own terms, rather than trying to shape them. In daily life, this kind of silence can be practiced even when you're not alone. You can speak less and listen more. You can pause before responding. You can drop the need to fill space. This opens up communication in a new way. People feel heard because you are no longer listening to respond, you're listening to see. You're not waiting for your turn to speak, you're allowing space for truth to emerge. And when you do speak, your words carry more weight, because they come from awareness, not habit, from presence, not performance. One word spoken from silence can shift an entire conversation. Not because it's clever, but because it's rooted in clarity. It doesn't carry the static of ego. It's clean, precise, kind. This is how noble silence cultivates wisdom. It removes the clutter. It sharpens perception. It helps you see what's beneath the surface. And it trains the mind to be stable not just when things are calm, but when chaos arises. Because once you know how to return to stillness, even briefly, you stop being a slave to the world's noise. It also brings healing. Many wounds live in unspoken spaces, pain we never had words for, traumas that can't be narrated. In silence, those wounds risen not to haunt us, but to be felt fully, without commentary. The mind doesn't need to label what it feels, it only needs to feel it, without agenda, without judgment. And when it does, something begins to shift. Silence gives the nervous system permission to unwind. Without constant stimulation, the body begins to regulate itself. Breathing deepens, muscles release, the heart rate slows. The immune system recalibrates. This is not abstract benefit, it's physiological transformation. Silence is not emptiness, it's medicine. And the longer you stay with it, the more your sensitivity grows. Not in a fragile way, but in a refined way. You start to notice subtle things, a change in tone, a shift in someone's energy. The difference between speaking from truth and speaking from tension. This awareness helps you respond not out of reflex, but from choice. And choice is freedom. When you see clearly, you stop reacting to everything. You stop speaking just to be heard. You stop filling silence because it feels awkward. You realize that real connection doesn't come from talking, it comes from presence. Some of the deepest moments between people are wordless. A glance, a breath, a shared pause. These moments carry more love than hours of conversation. In a world addicted to noise, noble silence is rebellion. Not angry rebellion, but sacred rebellion. It refuses to rush, it refuses to perform, it refuses to turn presence into productivity. It returns life to its natural rhythm unfolding, grounded, aware. And in that rhythm, you come home. You return to the source of speech. You remember that before every word, there was silence. Before every story, there was space. And within that space is the wisdom you've been searching for, not as information, but as realization. You start to trust silence. You start to love it. Not because it's quiet, but because it's true. Because it doesn't demand anything. Because it welcomes everything. And from that space, your life starts to change. Not dramatically, but deeply. You speak less and people listen more. You say less and people feel more. Because you're no longer trying to be heard, you're simply being. This is the language of enlightenment. It doesn't come through explanation. It comes through stillness. It speaks not to your mind, but through it. And when you hear it, even once, everything softens. You stop needing to prove. You stop needing to explain. You stop needing to defend. You rest in awareness. You live in presence. and you let silence finish the sentences the world never could. And once you've tasted the clarity that silence brings, something inside begins to rearrange. You no longer rush to label every emotion. You no longer need to grip every thought. You become more curious than controlling. But there's still something deeper worth understanding, something that explains why your sense of self keeps rebuilding itself, even when you've seen through it. Even after silence, the mind keeps reconstructing identity, thought by thought, reaction by reaction. You know you are not fixed, yet patterns return. Old feelings sneak in. The sense of me keeps reforming itself like smoke taking shape. This isn't failure, it's structure. And the Buddha didn't leave that mystery unanswered. He named it, not as dogma, but as insight into the machinery of human experience. This structure is made of 5 pieces, not 5 selves, not 5 souls, 5 shifting processes. Together, they create the illusion of a solid I. But when seen clearly, they reveal how empty that illusion really is. And when worked with skillfully, they become tools, not traps. The first is form, the physical body, the material aspect of being, what you see, touch, hear, smell, taste, your hands, your bones, your heartbeat. The texture of experience begins here. It is real but not personal. Your body is alive, yes, but it is not you in any permanent sense. It changes constantly, ages, heals, gets sick, grows, declines. It is influenced by food, weather, sleep, genetics. You don't control it, you witness it. And yet, so often, you identify with it. You look in the mirror and feel pride or shame. You feel pain and call it mine. But when you observe deeply, you see, the body is not an identity, it's a vehicle, a process, a constantly moving system of matter and energy. Next is sensation, the feeling tone of every moment, not emotion but raw feedback. Pleasant, unpleasant, neutral. Every experience you have carries one of these tones. You feel warmth, pleasant. You hear loud noise, unpleasant. You sit still, neutral. This might sound small, but this is where attachment begins. You crave the pleasant. You resist the unpleasant. You overlook the neutral. These micro-reactions shape your habits. They drive choices before thoughts even form. Sensation isn't optional, it happens naturally. But when you learn to notice it without clinging or resisting, the grip begins to loosen. Then comes perception, the labeling function of the mind. It organizes what the senses deliver. Color becomes tree, sound becomes voice, shape becomes threat. Perception pulls patterns from raw data and tells a story. But the story is often automatic, based on memory. You see a stranger and think unfriendly based on past pain. You hear a word and feel triggered because of old wounds. Perception isn't truth, it's recognition, and recognition is conditioned. When you start questioning it, your world opens. You see how fast the mind concludes, how quickly it decides, and how much of what you know isn't fresh, it's recycled. When perception slows, reality becomes clearer. The fourth is mental formation. These are the tendencies, impulses, habits, and intentions that form the personality, thoughts, emotions, moods, preferences, biases. This is where karma lives not as fate, but as pattern. These formations build over time. You react one way often enough, and it becomes familiar. It becomes you. But it's not you. It's just reinforced energy, a repeated loop. Mental formations can feel deeply personal, but they arise and fall like weather. With awareness, they can be rewired. With stillness, they can dissolve. They are not your essence. They are your conditioning, and conditioning can change. The last is consciousness, the basic knowing of experience, not the content, but the light in which content appears. Sight consciousness, sound consciousness, thought consciousness. This is the backdrop. The observer. But even this is not fixed. It depends on contact. Consciousness of a sound only arises when sound and ear and attention meet. Consciousness flickers. It flows. It isn't a soul hiding behind your eyes. It's a function. And when you realize it's not permanent, the whole scaffolding of I am begins to tremble. These five forms, sensation, perception, mental formation, consciousness, aren't parts of a person. They are activities, events, streams. And yet, when they work together, they feel like a self. But they're not a self. They're a show, a performance, one that repeats so often it fools even the actor. But here's the key. There's nothing wrong with them. The aggregates are not enemies. They're tools. Without them, there's no experience, no path, no learning. The problem comes only when they are mistaken for identity. When feeling pain becomes, I am suffering. When hearing a sound becomes, I am annoyed. When having a thought becomes, this defines me. That's where the knot tightens. But the moment you start observing the aggregates, they begin to separate. The space between stimulus and reaction grows. Instead of, I'm angry, it becomes, anger is present. Instead of, I'm confused, it becomes, confusion has arisen. And that shift is everything. It's the first step out of the trance. This is where the aggregates become a toolkit, not a trap. You start using them to diagnose your reactions. Is this form or perception? Is this sensation or emotion? Where did this formation come from? What intention is hidden beneath it? These questions don't freeze you. They free you because they turn reactivity into curiosity, and curiosity turns suffering into insight. The more you practice, the more quickly you see through the illusion. You catch yourself reaching for comfort and recognize pleasant sensation. You notice judgment rising and identify mental formation. You feel resistance to someone's words and realize painful contact and clinging perception. This isn't detachment. This is intimacy. You are no longer merged with your experience. You are in relationship with it. And from that relationship comes skill, wisdom, freedom. Not the freedom to escape life, but the freedom to stay present without getting trapped. The freedom to hold emotion without collapsing into it. The freedom to feel discomfort without needing to fix it immediately. You stop living in defense mode. You stop being bounced around by every trigger. You become grounded, not because you've stopped feeling, but because you've stopped believing that every feeling is truth. The aggregates also help with trauma, not by erasing it, but by helping you unpack it. Trauma embeds itself in the body, in form. It echoes in sensation. It hides in perception. It colors mental formations. It shapes consciousness. But when you know the parts, you stop being overwhelmed by the whole. You can work gently, one layer at a time, meeting the body, holding sensation, questioning perception, disentangling formations, watching consciousness. There's no rush, no pressure to be healed, just the steady practice of presence. And this presence becomes power. You start choosing how to respond, not because you suppress what you feel, but because you no longer mistake it for yourself. That's the power of the aggregates. They reveal how things function so you can stop worshipping the dysfunction. You don't need to dismantle the self with force. You only need to see clearly what it's made of. When you see that, the clinging starts to fade. And what remains is just awareness, just contact, just life unfolding. No me holding it together, no mind gripping it tight. Just experience, arising and passing, like waves on water. This is not detachment. This is awakening. Not distance, but discernment. Not numbness, but precision. The aggregates help you trace suffering to its roots, not so you can cut it off, but so you can understand it. And in that understanding, the pain loses its sting. Because the root of all suffering is not pain, it's identification. And when you see the parts clearly, there's no whole left to attach to. Just patterns, just process, just space. And in that space, peace arises. Not because nothing hurts, but because nothing owns you. And that is freedom. When you start to see your experience not as a fixed identity, but as a series of parts, constantly rising and falling, something else begins to reveal itself beneath the surface. A kind of invisible map, a chain, a pattern that keeps looping, feeding itself, building momentum. You begin to notice that nothing ever happens out of nowhere, that your reactions have roots, your habits have histories. Your emotions are not just emotions, they are results of causes that go unseen until you slow down enough to trace them. And that's where the teaching of dependent origination enters. Not as theory, but as an exposed engine of your daily life. 12 links, interconnected, one giving rise to the next, over and over. This isn't abstract metaphysics. This is what's happening when you pick up your phone for the 10th time without knowing why. This is what's playing out when an old memory floods your chest with emotion. This is what holds the shape of every addiction, every loop of regret, every repeated fight you thought you'd moved past. It all begins with ignorance. Not stupidity, just the basic not knowing of how things really are. It's the lack of clear seeing that causes us to misread life, to grasp where we should let go, to resist what must be felt. This isn't just philosophical ignorance. It's the kind that lives in your nervous system, that flinches before reflection, that tightens before questioning. Ignorance isn't always dramatic. Sometimes it's as subtle as an unconscious belief that you are unworthy, that you need to win to be loved, that comfort equals safety. And from this fog, everything else unfolds. Out of this lack of understanding comes mental formations, volitional impulses that arise conditioned by that unknowing. These are the seeds of action, the habitual pushes of intention shaped by your conditioning. When your beliefs are distorted, the intentions you act from follow that distortion. You react before you know why. You reach before you reflect. These aren't mistakes, they're patterns. But they accumulate, and the mind begins to move with increasing speed. From those formations arises consciousness, not pure awareness, but the specific consciousness that forms around contact. It's the knowing that something is happening, but already it's filtered. Already it's colored by the habits that formed it. It's not neutral, it's framed by the layers that came before. Then comes name and form the dual structure of mental and physical experience. This is the stage where you begin to perceive yourself as someone having an experience. It's the building of a scenario, the construction of me and this situation. It's no longer just sensation, it's my body feeling anxious, or my mind thinking this way. Here, the sense of self starts to become more solid, even though it's still just a cluster of processes. Then the 6 sense bases emerge: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mind. With these, your world begins to open through contact, not just raw sense, but emotional contact too. The sound of someone's voice, the look in someone's eyes, the feeling of being seen or ignored. Your senses are not neutral channels. They are constantly informing your experience, triggering memory, pulling emotional threads. And as these senses engage with the world, contact arises. That moment when sense, organ, object, and consciousness meet. It seems small, but it's a spark. Contact is not passive. It sets things in motion, it lights the match, and what it lights is feeling. This feeling, or Vedana, isn't emotion. It's the raw, affective tone, pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. Every time you experience something, there's a flavor, and that flavor pulls you. You want more of the pleasant. You resist the unpleasant. You ignore the neutral. This basic movement is often unconscious, but it drives the next step: craving. Craving is the leaning, the reaching, the aching for something. Not always obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, more like a pull in the background. But it starts here, in the feeling tone. This is the beginning of addiction, of obsession, of emotional fixation. It doesn't start with action, it starts with this invisible tug. And from craving comes clinging. This is the point where the desire becomes personal. You don't just want something, you believe you need it. You fuse your identity with the object. It's no longer just, I feel better when they text me. It's, I am not okay unless they do. Clinging turns a passing sensation into a source of self-worth, and that kind of pressure is never sustainable. Then, from this clinging comes becoming. The formation of new identity. You become someone driven by need, by desire, by fear. The self reshapes to support the attachment. You act in ways that reinforce the craving. You make decisions to protect what you're holding. This is where cycles start to harden. Relationships turn into roles. Freedom starts to disappear behind patterns. Out of this becoming, birth arises. Not just physical birth, but the birth of new circumstances, new consequences, new emotional realities. You say something you can't take back. You enter a situation shaped by past choices. A new identity steps forward to manage the discomfort. The mind believes the only solution is to be someone who fits this moment, and so it creates that someone. But every birth leads to aging and death, to decay. Every situation created under pressure eventually collapses. Every identity you cling to begins to crack. Every fix you hoped would work begins to wear thin. And when it does, there is grief, there is loss, there is fear, but most of all, there is another turn of the wheel. And if nothing is seen clearly, the whole cycle starts again. This isn't just philosophy, this is your life in motion. This is what happens when you check your phone for validation, when you eat to escape loneliness, when you lash out before pausing. Every time you repeat a behavior you know doesn't help but feels impossible to avoid it, because these links are moving beneath your awareness. But awareness is the key. You can't break the chain through force, you dissolve it through insight. You don't need to dismantle all 12 links, you only need to interrupt one, and the most powerful place to start is contact. That moment when you first feel something shift in the body, in the mind, in the senses. When you learn to pause there, the momentum weakens. By seeing contact clearly, you begin to watch the arising of feeling. You notice the urge to reach. You name the craving. You feel the cling, but you don't act it out. That's the turning point. That's where wisdom lives. Not in suppressing desire, but in meeting it without becoming it. And when you meet it like that, the story doesn't need to continue. The chain doesn't have to move forward. You can feel the craving without feeding it. You can allow the sensation without collapsing into it. You can stop identifying with the voice that says, I need this to be okay. This is freedom in real time. And it spreads. One moment of clarity becomes a shift in your relationships. You stop blaming others for your pain. You stop needing them to change so you can feel safe. You recognize how your reactions were never just reactions. They were results of an entire chain you didn't see until now. You also begin to notice how others are trapped in the same cycle, and that softens judgment. You stop taking things personally. You stop expecting perfection. You meet people at their level of conditioning, not to excuse, but to understand. And from there, boundaries become kinder, forgiveness becomes possible, not as an act of morality, but as a response to truth. Dependent origination isn't something to believe in, it's something to observe, every day, every breath. In the way a thought becomes an argument, in the way a glance becomes a story, in the way a mood becomes a whole day of avoidance. When you really see it, you stop being surprised by your own patterns. You stop thinking, this came out of nowhere. You begin to live more gently, because everything that arises has a reason. But that reason is not a sentence. It's a signal. It shows you where your attention is needed, where your clarity is missing, where your freedom begins. And freedom always begins now. Once you begin to see the wheel of dependent origination clearly, how craving leads to clinging, how contact feeds identity, how every loop is built from causes, you naturally start to ask the next question. What happens when the loop ends? If each moment of insight slows the cycle, if awareness stops the chain, what's on the other side? This is where things become both deeply peaceful and strangely unsettling, because the teachings say that when the cycle of becoming is broken, suffering ends. And while that sounds like the goal, like relief, like the end of all struggle, it also touches something most people don't expect to find on the spiritual path, a kind of hidden fear. Not fear of pain, not fear of failure, but fear of vanishing, of no longer being anyone at all. Because even after you've seen that the self is built from aggregates, even after you've watched the craving mind in real time, even after you've tasted non-reactivity, there's often a subtle hesitation. The mind pulls back. It doesn't say it out loud, but somewhere inside, the question lingers. If I let go of everything, what will be left of me? This is the fear of cessation, the fear that nirvana isn't rest but erasure, that enlightenment means disappearing, that liberation means no longer being human, no longer feeling, no longer existing in any way that's familiar. And this fear is not a flaw in your practice. It's part of the process, because the ego was never designed to dissolve itself. It exists to protect, to define, to maintain a sense of boundary. It holds a map that says, this is me, that is you, this is good, that is dangerous. And when the map starts to fade, when awareness begins to move beyond what can be named, the ego registers that shift as threat. Even if you've suffered under the weight of identity, the idea of being without it can feel worse, because pain is familiar, striving is familiar, control, even when exhausting, gives a sense of safety. The idea of no self, of complete release, feels like falling with no ground. The mind instinctively resists, not because it doesn't want freedom, but because it doesn't trust freedom without form. This fear shows up in subtle ways. In the urge to keep seeking even after silence is enough. In the tendency to reinterpret awakening as another version of achievement. In the habit of framing spirituality as self-improvement instead of self-erasure. These are all clever ways the mind tries to hold on while pretending to let go. And they are understandable, because from the perspective of ego, cessation means death. Not physical death, but the end of being someone, the end of reference points, the end of effort. And that idea, even when we say we want it, can trigger something primal. But what's actually being pointed to in cessation isn't non-existence. It's non-reaction. It's the complete stopping of the cycle of grasping. It's not that awareness ends, it's that clinging ends. What disappears is not life. It's the compulsive need to arrange life around a false center. Nirvana is not a void that swallows you. It's the ending of the burning, the extinguishing of the flame that never stopped seeking fuel. It's the deepest form of rest, not because you turn off, but because you stop resisting what already is. To reach this understanding, you have to look at your attachments to becoming, Not just desire for pleasure or comfort, but the deeper desire to be someone, even someone spiritual, even someone wise. The identity of the seeker can become the last and most seductive trap, because the seeker never finds. It can't. The very act of seeking reinforces separation. It keeps the goal just out of reach, and so part of the path is grieving the loss of that role, letting go not just of what hurts, but of the one who hurts. This isn't abandonment. It's the end of illusion, and the end of illusion often feels like loss before it feels like peace. There may be phases where the mind goes quiet and panic arises, where joy is present but it feels too unfamiliar to trust, where spaciousness starts to open and something inside rushes to fill it. That's not failure. That's the ego doing its job. But awareness sees it, and in seeing it, the grip begins to weaken. You also begin to notice that the fear of cessation is not constant. It arises only when the mind begins to approach stillness, when thought slows and silence stretches. That's when the anxiety starts, which tells you everything. The fear is not about truth. It's about the loss of noise. But noise is not safety, and silence is not absence. The more you sit with the fear without needing to solve it, the more it reveals its real nature. It's not fear of dying, it's fear of not knowing, of not having a role, of not being able to label or measure or hold on to something. And this fear dissolves not through explanation, but through direct contact. You stay with the stillness. You feel the unease. You breathe through the tension. And at some point, there's a shift. The fear itself becomes just another movement of mind, another formation, another link in the chain. And you don't need to push it away. You just don't need to follow it anymore. This is how resistance becomes the path, not by being avoided, but by being seen as it is. And as you keep walking, a new kind of trust begins to form. Not trust in beliefs, not trust in outcomes, but trust in awareness itself. In that which watches everything come and go, but does not come and go with it. This trust grows slowly. It builds through small moments. When you let go of an argument and feel lighter, when you release an identity and find more space, when you sit in silence and stop waiting for it to end. These are not dramatic moments, but they are the turning of the tide. Eventually, the fear of cessation becomes less gripping. It doesn't disappear completely, but it loses its control. You stop needing to be someone all the time. You stop needing to understand everything. You start relaxing into the unknown, not as a blankness, but as a presence too full to be described. And in that presence, freedom is not something you get. It's something you realize was always here, just hidden behind the need to be someone experiencing it. This is the paradox. The more you let go, the more complete you feel. The more you release your grip on self, the more love flows in. Not personal love, not conditional love, but a kind of radiant openness that doesn't need a name. The ego fears that enlightenment is the end of everything. But it's only the end of suffering built from illusion. It's not the death of being, it's the death of becoming. It's not loss, it's arrival. You don't lose who you are. You lose the confusion around who you thought you needed to be. And what remains is simple, quiet, clear, not as an experience, but as the end of the one who clings to experience. When the fear of non-existence begins to soften, something unexpected starts to appear beneath it. Not emptiness in a cold or distant sense, but a tenderness. A quiet space where presence sharpens, not because you're trying, but because there's nothing left to hold. The fight to preserve, to prolong, to define, begins to dissolve. And in its place, there's a clarity that feels deeper than thought, older than identity. But to fully embody this clarity, to live it and not just understand it, there's one more threshold that must be crossed: the direct contemplation of death. Not as an idea, not as something abstract or symbolic, but as a lived awareness that everything you see, touch, and know will end, that everyone you love will vanish, that your own body, no matter how carefully kept, will one day collapse into stillness and silence. This is not pessimism. This is not fear-mongering. It is truth, and it is the very foundation of radical presence. Maranasati, the practice of remembering death, is not about rehearsing tragedy. It's not about making yourself sad. It is about meeting life with full awareness of its impermanence. It is about opening your eyes to what is real, without flinching, without fantasy. And when done with sincerity, it doesn't make you colder. It makes you more alive. When death is no longer hidden from view, your priorities shift. You stop wasting time on things that don't matter. You stop arguing to be right when being kind is so clearly more urgent. You no longer delay your joy, waiting for a better time. You drop the fantasy that you'll live forever and start paying attention to this breath, this moment, this person in front of you. Contemplating death is the fastest way to clear the mind of illusion. It ends procrastination. It destroys arrogance. It humbles the mind without humiliating it. It brings clarity not through control, but through direct perception of what cannot be controlled. Everything in your life is marked by death, not just physical dying, but the ending of every moment. Every experience passes, every thought dissolves, every relationship changes, every plan falls apart or transforms. We live in constant death, but we don't see it because we're trained to look away. Maranasati reverses that habit. It brings the ending into awareness not to cause panic, but to end denial. And when denial ends, so does most of your unnecessary suffering. Because so much suffering is based on the false belief that things can be permanent, that people can stay the same, that identities can last, that comfort can be held, but they can't. And when you stop trying to preserve what cannot be preserved, your hands free up, your energy returns, you stop clinging, and in that release, a softer, wiser love begins to flow. Meditating on death trains the heart in this kind of love, a love that knows how to hold without gripping, how to care without needing, how to show up fully, not because the moment will last, but because it won't. This kind of love doesn't wait. It doesn't assume there's more time. It gives what it can now, speaks the truth now, forgives now, not because it's easy, but because it understands that delay is a luxury we don't truly have. Maranasati also reveals the ego's last stand, because death is the final challenge to the illusion of control. No matter how smart, powerful, spiritual, or healthy you are, you will die. And when that is no longer a threat, the ego loses one of its deepest fears. You stop needing to create a legacy to feel valid. You stop needing to be remembered to feel real. You start to see that value doesn't come from being permanent, it comes from being present. This changes how you hold your goals. You still act, but without obsession. You still build, but without anxiety. You still strive, but without believing that any achievement can protect you from the truth of impermanence. And so, oddly, the contemplation of death makes life lighter, more sacred, less heavy with ambition or regret. It breaks the trance of someday and replaces it with the urgency of now. This urgency is not about panic, it's about presence. It's about stopping the habit of waiting, waiting to rest, waiting to love, waiting to be free. Death shows you that what you're waiting for may never come, but what's here already is enough if you can see it clearly. Meditating on death also sharpens compassion. When you remember that everyone you meet is going to die, you soften. You understand that their anger might be pain, that their coldness might be fear, that their mistakes are temporary, that their lives, just like yours, are brief and difficult and tender. You stop needing others to act a certain way before you can forgive them. You stop needing every relationship to be resolved before you can let go. You stop needing closure to move on, because you realize that closure is a myth and that kindness now is more powerful than perfect endings later. This changes how you relate to grief. Instead of running from it, you begin to see it as sacred. Grief becomes proof of love, a kind of honoring. You no longer feel the need to rush it or fix it. You understand that grief, like all emotions, is impermanent too. And by being present with it, rather than resisting it, you allow it to move through you. You don't need to be strong. You just need to stay open. Maranasati also dissolves spiritual pride. It reminds you that no insight, no title, no level of understanding exempts you from mortality. Even the Buddha died. Even saints and sages turned to dust. This truth brings humility. It returns you to the ground, and it connects you to all beings not as a hierarchy, but as a shared journey. This sense of shared mortality makes division harder to maintain. It becomes difficult to hate someone when you remember they too are suffering, that they too are aging, that they too will one day be gone. This awareness isn't sentimental, it's raw and grounding, and it invites a deeper kind of wisdom. A wisdom that doesn't seek comfort, but clarity. Because once you see that death is certain, but the timing is not, you begin to live differently. You stop waiting for the right moment to start the practice, to speak your heart, to heal old wounds. You begin now, not because you're afraid, but because you're awake. And being awake means being intimate with life, as it is not as you want it to be. It means understanding that every breath could be the last, and meeting that truth with a soft and steady heart. This doesn't make you detached, it makes you fiercely kind. It gives you the strength to live without clinging, and the tenderness to say goodbye when it's time. Maranasati is the deepest form of letting go. Not just letting go of possessions or roles or control, but letting go of the illusion that any of it was ever really yours. Letting go of the belief that you were ever separate from the flow. It brings you to the edge of self and invites you to surrender, not to darkness, but to reality, to truth, to the living, breathing, ungraspable beauty of this moment, knowing it will never come again. And from that place, you begin to live not for outcome, but for presence. You speak what's true because silence is no longer a safe place to hide. You love fully because you understand that time cannot be hoarded. You forgive, not because it's easy, but because holding grudges begins to feel absurd in the face of death. And little by little, something shifts. Death is no longer a shadow to avoid. It becomes a teacher, a guide, a friend that reminds you, wake up. This life is passing, don't waste it. Let it humble you, let it sharpen you, let it soften you. And when the day comes, and it will, when your body begins to fall away, and the breath grows thin, and the world starts to fade, you won't need to panic. You won't need to beg for more time. You'll know that you lived while you could. You stayed present when it mattered. You didn't run from truth. You met life fully, and so you can meet death the same way. Without clinging, without fear, just presence, just awareness, just peace. After sitting with death, not in fear but in truth, something in the mind begins to shift. You've touched the limits of what can be held, and in that contact, the grasping starts to loosen. But just when silence deepens and the sense of release begins to form, the pull returns. A subtle urge to do, to become, to reach, to fix, to improve, as if peace itself were not enough. That is the cycle, that is the loop, that is samsara. It doesn't announce itself with drama, it doesn't need to, it's woven into the very rhythm of unconscious living. You wake up with clarity, and by afternoon you're back in thought, in chase, in craving. You resolve to be present, but a single emotion pulls you back into story. This repetition isn't because you failed. It's because the mind has been trained to feed on becoming, to need something just out of reach, to feel complete. Samsara is not just a cosmological wheel of birth and death. It's the psychological pattern of never being at rest. It's the structure of seeking. It's not limited to a future life or mythical realm. It happens every time you try to escape the moment, through fantasy, distraction, blame, or control. It's not far away. It's right here, and it's exhausting. This is why the Buddha framed samsara as suffering. Not because life itself is flawed, but because the way we relate to it keeps pulling us out of peace. Even in happiness, there's tension, a need to hold it, a fear of losing it, a compulsion to recreate it. Pleasure never feels complete because the moment it arises, the mind begins to plan its return. And in that planning, rest is lost. Look closely and you'll see this everywhere. The way you check your phone for no reason, the way you reach for stimulation when silence gets too loud, the way you construct identities, goals, relationships not from love, but from lack. Samsara is the addiction to self-construction, not just desire for things, but desire for being something. Someone, important, safe, admired, in control. Addiction doesn't always involve substances. Sometimes it looks like productivity, or self-improvement, or spiritual seeking. Anything that promises relief while keeping you dependent is part of the cycle. The object shifts pleasure, attention, status, but the function remains the same. Chase, grasp, repeat. And like addiction, samsara feeds on ignorance. You don't see the loop because you're inside it. You think the discomfort means you need more love, more clarity, more change when, in truth, the discomfort is pointing to the craving itself. Not the absence of peace, but the refusal to stop reaching for it. The mind becomes conditioned to movement. It mistakes momentum for meaning. Stillness feels foreign, even threatening. So it spins stories, replays the past, projects into the future, all to avoid the rawness of now. This is not a fault, it's a habit, a deeply wired one. But it can be unlearned. The first step is recognizing the loop, not just intellectually, but in direct experience. You feel a pleasant sensation, and the mind wants more. You feel an unpleasant one, and the mind wants out. Every reaction becomes a breadcrumb, leading you back to the core pattern: grasping, avoiding, becoming. To step out, you don't need to renounce the world. You need to renounce the fantasy that anything in the world can complete you, that any version of you is final, that any state, once achieved, will be safe forever. These beliefs keep samsara spinning. Letting them go doesn't mean apathy, it means freedom. Freedom from needing every feeling to last. Freedom from turning discomfort into identity. Freedom from the idea that your worth is tied to performance. This is what it means to break the addiction. Not to stop feeling, but to stop feeding. This takes honesty. You have to look at the subtle payoffs, the hidden satisfactions of your suffering, the self-pity that brings comfort, the drama that provides meaning, the craving that makes you feel alive, even if it burns. Samsara survives because part of you keeps choosing it. That choice is not wrong, it's unconscious. But the moment it becomes conscious, change becomes possible. When you see clearly that the loop doesn't satisfy, even when it delivers, you stop glorifying its rewards. You start turning towards stillness not as an escape, but as a return. You remember what it feels like to not need anything. And in that memory, something begins to heal. Healing doesn't mean pleasure, it means integration. Feeling what arises without chasing or resisting it. Being with discomfort without needing to name it. That's what breaks the loop. Not a sudden enlightenment, but the slow, steady work of not abandoning the moment. This work shows up in daily choices, choosing presence over distraction, silence over reaction, truth over comfort. Not because it's easy, but because samsara never gives you what it promises. Even when it delivers pleasure, it takes peace. Even when it offers identity, it steals freedom. This doesn't mean you reject joy. It means you stop making joy the condition for rest. You start resting in what's here, and what's here might be boring, or painful, or uncertain, but it's real, and reality is the only place freedom lives. In time, you begin to see that the cycle feeds itself. Craving produces action. Action produces identity. Identity produces more craving. The only way out is to stop believing that identity must be constant. When you let identity shift, soften, even dissolve, samsara starts to lose its grip. This doesn't mean you stop functioning. You still feel, still work, still connect. But you do it from presence, not need. You speak not to control, but to express. You act not to become someone, but to respond to what's needed. This kind of action is clean. It leaves no residue. It doesn't feed the loop. The more you live from this space, the more the cycle weakens. Old triggers still arise, but they lose their urgency. Desires still visit, but they no longer command. The addiction starts to fade, not by force, but by understanding. You begin to trust stillness, not because it guarantees safety, but because it reflects what you already are: awake, aware, complete. Samsara ends not through escape, but through direct presence, through refusing to leave this moment for a better one, through ending the search, not because there's nothing to find, but because nothing was missing. And in this ending, life doesn't become dull, it becomes intimate. You no longer chase experience, you meet it. You no longer wait for freedom, you embody it. That is the way out, not up, not around, but through. Once you begin stepping out of the loop of compulsive becoming, life stops revolving around craving. The noise begins to thin out. But quiet doesn't mean weakness. Presence doesn't mean passivity. In fact, something unexpected starts to arise, a kind of strength that doesn't seek control, but clarity. A sharpness that doesn't come from ego, but from understanding. What begins to awaken is the energy we rarely speak of in spiritual contexts. Anger. Not the kind that destroys, the kind that sees, the kind that burns through illusion. This is sacred anger. Not rage, not reactivity, but the deep force of compassion that refuses to tolerate harm. It's the fire that comes from a clear heart, not a bruised one. It is fierce, but it is not violent. It is direct, but it is never cruel. In Buddhist traditions, particularly Tibetan and Zen lineages, this energy is not rejected. It is honored, transformed, directed toward wisdom. In Tibetan iconography, wrathful deities wear terrifying expressions. They carry weapons, stand in flames, trample ignorance underfoot. But these are not demons. They are protectors of truth. They don't arise to punish. They arise to cut through delusion. Their appearance is fierce because their compassion is too urgent to be soft. Their energy is needed when kindness alone is not enough to wake the sleeping mind. This form of anger doesn't come from self. It doesn't say, "You hurt me." It says, "This harm must end." It arises not from injury, but from love too deep to allow deception to continue. It breaks patterns, but not with hate. It clears space, but not to dominate. It speaks hard truths, not to punish, but to protect what's sacred. This force is rare because it requires deep inner clarity. Without that, anger easily becomes polluted by pride, by fear, by attachment to being right. But when the mind is clean, when the ego is quiet and love is the root, anger becomes a tool of awakening. It becomes medicine. In Zen, this quality appears as directness. Masters who strike the floor, who shout to shock the student out of thought. These are not performances, they are calibrated responses, spontaneous, clear, aligned with the moment. Their purpose is not to control, but to disrupt the habit of clinging, and it works because it carries no residue. The teacher doesn't cling to the outburst. The moment it lands, it is gone. No self left to defend, no anger left to explain. This is what makes sacred anger so different from ordinary aggression. It leaves nothing behind. It doesn't poison the field. It doesn't tighten the body. It doesn't harden the heart. It burns clean, like dry wood, hot, fast, done. In everyday life, this expression is needed more than we admit. Compassion is often misunderstood as politeness, as being quiet in the face of injustice. But true compassion sometimes says no. It draws a line. It removes the sword from its sheath, not to harm, but to stop harm. This is the energy that protects children, that defends the vulnerable, that refuses to let silence be mistaken for agreement. Sacred anger rises when empathy meets responsibility, when stillness meets injustice and refuses to look away. But this power can only be trusted when the inner fire is anchored in wisdom. That's why most expressions of anger do not qualify, because they come from personal pain, from fear of loss, from wounded ego. Even when they feel justified, they often cause harm. Sacred anger is different. It asks nothing for itself. It serves clarity. To wield this kind of fire, you must know your own shadow. You must have met your anger in silence, sat with it long enough to see its roots, listened to its story without collapsing into it. Only then can you tell the difference between anger that burns to defend ego and anger that burns to protect truth. This clarity is not theoretical, it's felt in the body. Ordinary anger contracts. Sacred anger expands. One feels hot and chaotic, the other feels precise and grounded. One spins, the other cuts. One leaves you drained, the other leaves you clear. Because sacred anger is not reactive, it's responsive. It waits, it listens, it speaks only when silence no longer serves. And when it speaks, it doesn't shout to silence others. It speaks so others might finally hear. The ethical foundation of this energy is non-harming. Ahimsa. It is never about punishment, it is always about protection. Even when the words are strong, even when the stance is firm, the intention is never to destroy. It is to restore balance, to reveal truth, to stop cycles of harm that softer speech could not reach. This form of anger also includes grief. It knows how much has been lost. It doesn't deny pain. It carries the weight of what has been broken, but it doesn't collapse. It rises because it must. Because silence would be a form of betrayal. Because presence sometimes means stepping forward when everything inside wants to step back. For many, this energy feels unsafe, especially if anger was modeled as chaos. But sacred anger is never out of control. It's not yelling in the kitchen. It's not shaming people online. It's not bitterness dressed up as activism. Sacred anger has no interest in victory, only in truth. To channel this energy, your own wounds must be seen. If not, anger will become projection. It will target others instead of confronting ignorance. It will seek revenge instead of resolution. Sacred anger can only be held by a heart that has no enemies, that wants no war. This does not mean being neutral in the face of injustice. It means being precise, knowing when to speak, how to speak, what the moment actually needs. Sometimes that's gentle guidance. Sometimes it's a raised voice. Sometimes it's a boundary. Sometimes it's a refusal to move. But it always comes from love. Love for truth, love for all beings, even those causing harm. This is the hardest part. Sacred anger must hold even the oppressor in awareness. It must want their awakening, not their destruction. It must see that their actions are rooted in confusion, in pain, in disconnection, and it must respond without forgetting that. This level of compassion is fierce. It doesn't indulge cruelty, but it also doesn't become cruel in response. It protects without creating more enemies. It resists without dehumanizing. It cuts through ignorance without losing tenderness. In this way, sacred anger becomes a practice, a mirror, a discipline. It asks you to stay awake when everything in you wants to lash out. It asks you to check your motives, your tone, your impact. And it gives you the courage to speak when silence would cost too much. You learn when fire is needed and when it's not. You learn how to walk into the heat without burning others. You learn how to burn without leaving scars. And most of all, you learn how to stop fearing your power, to stop mistaking gentleness for goodness, to stop confusing suppression with peace. Peace is not passive. It is rooted, alert, capable of fierce clarity when the moment calls for it. This is what wrathful compassion teaches, that sometimes love must roar, but it roars not to destroy. It roars to wake us up. When fierce compassion settles, when the fire has spoken and the noise has cleared, what remains is not just stillness, it's exposure. There's nothing left to blame, nothing left to fight. No enemy outside, no injustice to resist in this moment. And it's here, in this quiet after the storm, that something subtler begins to appear. A voice that doesn't shout. It whispers. A gentle craving, not for pleasure or power, but for progress, for spiritual validation, for improvement, for being more enlightened than before. This craving wears soft clothes. It speaks with soothing words, but it's no different from any other form of ego. It's the self, remade in spiritual terms. And if you're not paying attention, it will take everything you've practiced and use it to strengthen the very illusion you were trying to let go of. This is spiritual materialism. It's the ego, disguised as growth. It's self-centeredness wrapped in sacred language. It doesn't care about truth. It cares about identity, about being seen as someone wise, peaceful, advanced. It uses meditation as a tool to become a better version of me, not to dismantle the idea of me altogether. And the danger is not just that this happens, it's that it looks and feels like progress. This is why the path gets so subtle. At some point, it's not your suffering that traps you, it's your idea of awakening. It's not the obvious craving that misleads you. It's the refined hunger to be free of craving that becomes its own form of clinging. You sit on the cushion, not to be present, but to be someone who meditates. You read scriptures, not for insight, but for self-definition. You count days of mindfulness like trophies. You judge others silently for being less aware. You speak softly, but carry the weight of silent comparison. It's the same cycle, just better dressed. This illusion of progress is particularly strong in cultures that equate growth with accumulation. The mind is conditioned to measure success, to want more insight, more peace, more presence. But true spiritual work is not about adding anything. It's about subtracting what isn't real. It's not about becoming more, it's about needing less. But this doesn't sell. And so the world has built an industry around the illusion. Meditation apps with progress bars, courses that promise transformation in weeks, quotes that reduce wisdom to a catchy line. None of this is wrong by itself, but when it becomes another ladder to climb, it reinforces the exact mindset the path is meant to dissolve. You begin to confuse effort with evolution. You think the more disciplined you are, the closer you are to truth. But discipline alone doesn't dismantle illusion. Sometimes it just deepens the ego's grip. You can meditate every day for years and still be trapped in self-concept. You can speak about emptiness and still be driven by the need to be seen as awakened. This is the hardest deception to catch because it feels noble. You're not chasing fame or money, you're chasing freedom. But if that freedom is still defined by the image you have of yourself, it's just another version of imprisonment. And no amount of spiritual vocabulary will set you free from something you're secretly feeding. So what to do? First, slow down. Not just your body. Slow down the movement inside you that seeks to arrive somewhere, that wants to be done, that wants a certificate, even if it's invisible. That subtle pressure is the ego's last defense. It doesn't want to disappear, so it reinvents itself as the one doing the work. The only response is honesty, not judgment, not shame, just clear seeing, noticing when your spiritual identity gets activated, noticing when your words serve image more than truth, noticing when you are performing awareness instead of living it. These aren't mistakes, they are turning points. If you see them clearly, they lose their power. You begin to ask deeper questions, not "Am I improving?" but "Am I being honest?" Not "How far along am I?" but "What am I still trying to protect?" Progress stops being the goal. Presence becomes enough. You don't need to feel awakened, you just need to stop pretending. Pretending doesn't always mean lying. Sometimes it means avoiding the parts of you that still hurt, that still cling, that still ache for validation. You hide these behind perfect posture, calm voice, and a collection of insights. But truth doesn't care about your image, it waits for your sincerity. This is where the real path begins again, in the unglamorous space where humility grows, where you admit that all your understanding hasn't yet ended your grasping, that all your language hasn't yet ended your judgment, that all your spiritual moments haven't ended the subtle wish to be someone better than others. But you don't hate yourself for it, you bow to it, you see it clearly and smile not because it's gone, but because it's no longer hiding. You don't need to be perfect, you need to be transparent. And transparency begins when progress stops being the goal. This doesn't mean giving up on practice. It means letting practice become quiet, letting it become a mirror, not a project. A path that strips you down, not builds you up. A way of being that softens, rather than sharpens, your sense of self. You start asking, what part of me still wants to be special? What part of me still needs to feel ahead? What would happen if I let that dissolve? These questions sting, but they also heal, because they open a door that effort can't find, a door that leads not to more progress, but to freedom from needing progress. You stop measuring, you stop comparing, you stop using others as mirrors for your worth. The urge to show, to teach, to be seen fades not because it's bad, but because it no longer makes sense. You don't need to be seen as awakened. You need to awaken from the need to be seen. And in that letting go, something real returns. Not a version of yourself, not a performance, but presence. Humble, quiet, full. This is not the end of practice. It's the beginning of practice without pretense. Practice without the hunger for outcome. It becomes about listening, not achieving. About aligning with truth, not upgrading your identity. Spiritual materialism can't survive in this space because there's nothing left to sell, no self to decorate, no progress to display. Just awareness, meeting life directly, meeting pain without story, meeting joy without needing it to stay, meeting others without needing them to reflect anything back. This is where peace becomes real, not because everything is resolved, but because the need to resolve disappears. You don't need every answer. You don't need every insight. You don't need to feel enlightened. You just need to stop clinging to the idea of a spiritual self. And once that is gone, what remains is not emptiness in the painful sense. It is freedom. Quiet, whole, enough. Once the illusion of a spiritual identity has been gently dismantled, what's left is raw presence unadorned, honest, and exposed to the world as it is. And in this clarity, something urgent starts to rise. Not personal urgency, collective. The weight of what we've done to each other, to the earth, to future generations. It enters not as a concept, but as a felt ache, the temperature rising, the species disappearing, the skies growing stranger, and suddenly, awakening isn't just about peace, it's about responsibility. This is where the Dharma meets crisis. It's one thing to talk about suffering on a cushion. It's another to witness it in the soil, the oceans, the lungs of children breathing poisoned air. The Four Noble Truths were not meant to sit still inside monasteries. They were meant to meet the fire of the world. And now that fire is everywhere. So we begin, as always, with truth. The first noble truth is not a pessimistic declaration. It is a radical act of honesty. There is suffering, and right now that suffering is global. It's ecological, it's systemic, it's emotional. It shows up in grief that has no clear source, in dread that hums beneath daily life, in numbness, denial, and panic. In the helplessness we feel when facing something so vast it seems ungraspable. But turning away doesn't help. Spiritual bypass only deepens the disconnection. When you look clearly, you see it. The earth is sick. The systems we built are unsustainable. The harm is not theoretical. It is physical, and it is already here. The question is not whether we will feel pain, it is how we meet it. This is where the second truth comes in. There is a cause. Suffering doesn't come from nowhere. It arises from craving, from the grasping that says more is always better, from the belief that nature is here to be used, from the stories we tell about endless growth, personal convenience, and disconnection from what supports our life. The climate crisis is not a random catastrophe. It's the result of deep habits of mind greed, denial, short-term thinking. And these habits are not just political or economic, they're personal. The way we consume, the way we numb, the way we stay busy to avoid feeling, the way we make the destruction of the planet someone else's problem. This isn't about blame, it's about seeing clearly how deeply entangled we are in the very systems causing harm. But the Dharma never stops at diagnosis. The third truth is hope or not, blind hope, but grounded hope. If the cause can be understood, it can be let go. Suffering can end, even here, even now. Not by reversing the past, but by shifting the present. By responding instead of reacting. By staying awake in the face of despair and refusing to turn away. The path to that kind of clarity is the fourth truth, the Eightfold Path. And it applies here not as abstraction, but as practical guidance. Right view means seeing the crisis without distortion, not just through headlines, but with the eyes of interdependence. Recognizing that climate change is not just about weather, it's about suffering. It's about lives disrupted, homes lost, cultures erased. It's about people who did the least harm suffering the most. Right view pierces through the illusion that we are separate from what's happening. Right intention means aligning our hearts, letting go of hatred, indifference, and hopelessness, cultivating thoughts of compassion, restraint, and courage. Not because we're perfect, but because we've seen that the alternative, apathy or despair, leads nowhere. Intention is the foundation. It's where every choice begins. Right speech means telling the truth about what's happening. It means not staying silent when silence becomes complicity. but it also means speaking in a way that wakes people up, not shuts them down. It means refusing to fall into blame, even while naming what must change. Words become tools for healing, not weapons for shaming. Right action becomes obvious when presence deepens. It's not about being pure. It's about being accountable. It's about reducing harm where we can. It's about protecting what needs to be protected. It's about interrupting the cycle of consumption, not just by buying differently, but by relating to desire itself with awareness. Right livelihood challenges us to ask deeper questions, not just what we do for money, but what we support with our time, attention, and choices. Are we contributing to systems that destroy life, or to those that restore it? Livelihood is not just career, it's participation, and waking up means participating differently. Right effort means not giving up, even when the problem feels too big, even when progress is slow. It means sustaining the work without becoming brittle, without burning out. It means knowing the difference between force and devotion, between urgency and panic, and returning again and again to the small actions that add up over time. Right mindfulness becomes the anchor, not just watching breath, but watching how your choices ripple, watching how fear tries to take over, watching how distraction pulls you out of presence. Mindfulness means noticing your reaction to every article, every protest, every moment of quiet overwhelm, staying with it instead of shutting down. Right concentration doesn't mean escaping into stillness. It means learning to rest in attention that can hold discomfort. To stay focused not on outcomes, but on what matters. It means cultivating the inner steadiness to meet the world as it is, without collapsing. These steps are not idealistic, they are urgent, and they do not require perfection. They require sincerity. Each one is a tool to return us to presence in the midst of crisis. Each one is a way of living that does not depend on guarantees. Because the truth is, we do not know what will happen, but that does not absolve us from caring. The Dharma is not a path of certainty, it's a path of clarity. You don't act because you know it will succeed. You act because it's the right thing to do, because in doing it, your heart becomes whole even if the world doesn't change fast enough. And it's here that grief becomes sacred. You stop resisting it. You let it move through you. You cry for the forests, the coral, the species already lost. You grieve the ignorance that brought us here. But you do not grieve alone. You sit with others who are awake. And together, your grief becomes fuel not for despair, but for compassion that can hold the weight of this moment without falling apart. This is what it means to apply the Dharma in crisis. Not to escape pain, but to meet it fully. To walk the path not just for yourself, but for all beings. To see the earth not as scenery but as a living teacher, a being who has given everything and now asks us to remember who we are. And who we are is not separate, not from each other, not from the damage, not from the healing. This is our work, and it begins again. Every moment we choose presence over panic, courage over comfort, love over avoidance. The Four Noble Truths were never meant to stay small. They were meant to meet the world exactly as it is, and help us show up with both feet on the ground and nothing left to protect but what truly matters. As the world burns and the Dharma invites us to face it without turning away, something more intimate begins to stir beneath the ashes, something closer than climate, older than fear. The question of who we are, not just as a species or as participants in a wounded planet, but as people, as bodies, as identities. As the stories we've carried, often silently, about what it means to exist in the shape we've been given. This is not a detour from the path. This is the path, because the suffering we feel in the world is inseparable from the suffering we carry within. And one of the most tightly woven knots is identity itself, especially the identities that were assigned to us before we could speak. Gender is one of them, one of the loudest, most persistent, and most invisible forces shaping perception, value, and belonging. But the Dharma offers a different way to see. Anatha's teaching of not-self is not a rejection of existence. It's an invitation to see what is truly real beneath the layers of conditioning. It's a lens that shows us how every form we cling to eventually causes suffering, not because it is wrong, but because it is mistaken for something solid. Gender, in this light, becomes one more form, a formation, a pattern of sensations, expectations, ideas, and stories layered over flesh. It feels personal, but it's built from collective memory, passed down, reinforced, rewarded or punished, and none of it lasts. To explore this isn't to deny the pain that gender identity can hold. It's to free it, to see how even our most intimate experiences of self are not fixed entities, but processes. It is not an attack on who you are, it is a gentle unraveling of who you think you must always be. The goal is not to erase the gendered body or lived experience. It is to stop confusing experience with essence. When the Buddha taught the skandhas form, sensation, perception, formations, and consciousness, he showed how what we call a person is a temporary event. These aggregates shape how we feel, how we see, how we are seen, but none of them are independent. None of them point to a permanent I. Gender lives inside this system. It arises in form the body. It is interpreted through sensation, comfort or discomfort in that body. It is filtered through perception, how others label and respond. It is constructed through mental formations, thoughts, beliefs, reactions. And it becomes conscious when we are aware of it as me or mine. But each of these layers changes. The body changes. The way we relate to it changes. Society's labels evolve. Our inner responses shift. What once felt like truth might later feel like restriction. This movement doesn't mean there's no reality to gender experience. It means that experience isn't frozen. It moves like breath, like seasons. And when we forget this, suffering grows. Suffering shows up when gender becomes a box, a performance, a requirement. It shows up when we are told to shrink or harden, to hide softness or kill our rage, to play roles that suffocate or erase. The rigidity causes pain not just for those who don't conform, but for anyone who's ever felt pressure to be someone they aren't. And Buddhism, in its deepest wisdom, does not ask you to conform. It asks you to inquire. It invites you to look. What is this identity made of? What supports it? Who benefits from it? What happens when it isn't clung to? The practice doesn't force neutrality. It doesn't demand androgyny or sameness. It invites curiosity. It makes space for what is fluid. It makes room for joy in expression and freedom in letting go. Because when you stop needing gender to define your worth, you begin to discover other ways to relate. You can wear what you want, speak how you speak, move as you move, without performing a script. This freedom is not theoretical, it is felt. In moments when no one is watching and you breathe without armor. In moments when you don't have to explain yourself. In moments when you can say, this, right now, is me, even if it looks different tomorrow. The path of not-self doesn't ask you to stop being. It asks you to stop clinging, to stop wrapping your identity around patterns that shift. To find peace not in being seen a certain way, but in being at home with the changing nature of experience itself. This approach dissolves the false choice between erasing identity and clinging to it. It offers a third way, intimacy without attachment. You can honor your history, your pronouns, your pain, and your becoming without needing any of it to be permanent. You can transition not just your body, but your understanding of what it means to exist. In this space, compassion grows, because when you stop holding tightly to your own identity, you stop projecting expectations onto others. You begin to see people as they are, not as their roles, labels, or categories. You stop needing to sort them. You start meeting them. This meeting becomes sacred, because it's not clouded by projection. It's not filtered through assumptions about what a man should be, what a woman should act like, what non-binary means. You realize these questions come from confusion. Not because people are confusing, but because our models are too small. And when models break, freedom begins. Freedom not as erasure, freedom as recognition, that beneath all forms there is awareness. Not male, not female, not in between. Just presence, just wakefulness. This awareness doesn't erase your gender, it holds it gently. It lets it breathe. It lets it shift. It doesn't ask you to choose between being spiritual and being real. It asks you to be honest. And honesty means saying this: gender can be beautiful. It can be painful. It can be both. And neither. And something else entirely. The Dharma doesn't deny this. It sits with it. It offers tools to work with it. It reminds you that whatever you experience, it is not who you are. You are not your pronouns. You are not your dysphoria. You are not your conformity. You are not your rebellion. You are not the roles placed on you by parents, peers, or systems that never asked what you felt. You are awareness, moving through form, watching each identity arise and fall, learning to love without owning, learning to release without rejecting. In this freedom, everything becomes more human. There is more softness, more breath, more space. You begin to speak less from position and more from presence. You stop needing to defend something that no longer feels like a cage. And the world begins to shift, not because it finally sees you, but because you no longer need it to. You've seen yourself clearly, beyond shape, beyond name. And in that seeing, identity returns not as burden but as offering, a way to relate, a way to serve, a way to express, not to prove. This is what it means to transcend without denying, to be fully here and also free. This is where the path continues, not beyond gender, but through it, with eyes open, with heart soft, with ego quiet, just presence, just the breath, just now. When identity softens and the need to define yourself fades into presence, something ancient remains, waiting. Beneath all roles, beyond gender, even after letting go of the self, there is still movement. There is still energy. There is still longing, not just for connection or clarity or freedom, but something more primal, something older than language. The body feels it. The heart recognizes it. The mind doesn't know what to do with it. This is desire. And for many spiritual paths, desire is seen as the obstacle, as the cause of suffering, something to transcend, purify, or eliminate. But within the Vajrayana tradition, a different door opens. One that doesn't ask you to run from desire, but to meet it fully, to study it, to ride its energy all the way back to its source, for pleasure, not for escape, but for awakening. Tantric Buddhism is not separate from the rest of the path. It builds upon the foundation laid by Shila, Samadhi, and Prajna ethics, concentration and wisdom. But it works with the raw material differently. It doesn't separate sacred from sensual. It doesn't split the world into pure and impure. It sees desire not as a poison to be avoided, but as a powerful fuel that, when transmuted, can lead directly to realization. The difference is not in the desire itself, but in how it's held. Ordinarily, desire pulls. It grabs. It narrows your vision toward a single object. It creates the illusion that something outside must be acquired to feel whole. That movement is what causes suffering, not the feeling of desire, but the grasping that follows it. Vajrayana turns toward that pull with full attention and asks, "What is this made of? What's underneath the heat? What does it want, really?" The answer isn't in the object. The object is only the surface. Underneath every form of desire is a deeper longing to dissolve separation, to return to unity, to remember wholeness. The body may translate it sexually, the heart may shape it emotionally, the mind may interpret it symbolically, but the root is the same, a wish to come home. Tantric practice uses that energy rather than rejecting it. It doesn't indulge it blindly or chase after experience. It contains it, channels it, refines it. The language of the Tantras speaks of union of method and wisdom, of form and emptiness, of masculine and feminine principles, not as genders, but as dynamic polarities within the mind and the universe itself. These polarities, when harmonized, create a field where duality begins to collapse. Desire is no longer about reaching outward, it turns inward. It becomes the fire that reveals the spaciousness behind form. It becomes a doorway to bliss, not as pleasure alone, but as the natural radiance of a mind no longer split. This requires tremendous stability. Tantric paths are not shortcuts, they are precise and demanding. They ask the practitioner to have already seen through the ordinary ego, to have trained the mind in calm and insight, to have cultivated renunciation not from life, but from delusion. Because without that, desire easily reverts to craving. The energy collapses back into identification. Tantric practice is not about acting out every impulse, it's about transforming the impulse at its root, turning the fuel of desire into light. That alchemy only works when the container is strong, when intention is pure, and when guidance is clear. The process involves visualization, mantra, mudra, and subtle body awareness. These are not decorations, they are technologies, tools for awakening through direct engagement with form and energy. The deity visualizations are not fantasies, they are mirrors. Each figure, wrathful or peaceful, represents a quality of mind. Desire is included, transformed, not demonized, not suppressed. By meditating on these figures, the practitioner learns to hold powerful emotional and energetic states without being consumed by them. Bliss arises not as escape, but as recognition. The bliss of emptiness seen clearly, of ego softening, of union realized, not through external fulfillment, but internal integration. Sexual union is sometimes used as metaphor. In some lineages, it is also used literally, but only within specific vows, intentions, and sacred frameworks. It is never casual. It is never for personal gain. It is a ritual of embodiment, of non-duality, of awareness penetrating form, not as entertainment, as practice. For most, the core work is internal. The alchemy of desire happens within your own experience. The longing you feel for another becomes a doorway. You trace it back. You find its source. You see that the beauty you projected was always your own radiance reflected, and in that moment, the desire dissolves into presence, not because it was wrong, but because it has fulfilled its purpose. This shift in relationship to desire ripples out. It changes how you love. You stop needing others to complete you. You stop manipulating to be needed. You begin to love not for reward, but because it is your nature. That love becomes generous, fierce, alive, no longer limited by form, no longer trapped in stories of possession or loss. This doesn't mean you become cold. It means your warmth expands. You can feel deeply without drowning. You can want without clinging. You can be intimate without collapsing. Desire becomes a song you know how to hear without needing to chase the echo. This refinement applies to every level of experience, not just romantic longing, the desire for success, for recognition, for comfort, for truth. All of it becomes workable. All of it becomes fuel for practice. You don't deny your hunger, you learn how to cook with it. And the more skillful you become, the more space you find. You notice when desire is clean and when it is distorted, when it opens you and when it closes you, when it is rooted in freedom and when it is hiding fear. This discernment doesn't require repression, it requires honesty. And that honesty leads to humility, because you begin to see how often desire still pulls you, how easy it is to turn spiritual longing into ego performance, how easily bliss becomes addiction. How often we confuse connection with merging. The practice never stops, the refining never ends, but the suffering lessens, the fear lessens, the shame softens. Because you no longer see desire as failure, you see it as movement, as energy, as part of being alive. But you're no longer owned by it. You meet it. You bow to it. You walk with it until it points back to its origin, which is always stillness, which is always awareness, which is always here. After walking through the transformation of desire, something deeper is revealed, not through effort, but through tenderness. You begin to notice that the journey, no matter how solitary it feels, is never truly walked alone. Even in silence, there have been voices. Even in stillness, there have been eyes that reflected your truth back to you when you forgot how to see it. Awakening is not just shaped by the teachings you receive or the meditations you complete. It is also shaped by those who walk beside you, not to lead, not to follow, but to stay close enough that presence becomes shared. This is the heart of Kalyana Mitta, friendship. This kind of friendship is not built on convenience or similarity. It is not measured by time spent or interests shared. It is grounded in clarity, integrity, and mutual commitment to the path of truth. It is not about fixing one another, but about holding space for what is real to emerge. These are the relationships that do not turn away when your mask slips. They don't need you to perform being awakened. They stay when you're raw, when you're confused, when you're in doubt, because they see beyond the roles and into your potential. A noble friend reflects back not who you think you are, but who you are beneath the story. They remind you, without effort, of what matters most. Their presence doesn't distract you from the path, it deepens it. They challenge you without superiority. They listen without needing to rescue. Their wisdom doesn't overpower, it invites your own. The Buddha himself said that noble friendship is not half the path, it is the whole of it. Because isolation breeds distortion. Without the mirror of another, it's easy to get lost in your own projections. The ego is clever, and the spiritual ego even more so. A noble friend doesn't let you stay hidden. They call you back, gently, firmly, with love rooted in awareness. These relationships are rare not because people don't care, but because few are willing to stay honest. Noble friendship requires mutual vulnerability. You can't hide behind your insights. You can't posture your practice. There has to be room for failure, for confusion, for not knowing. And in that openness, something sacred grows, a kind of intimacy, not based on need, but on shared dedication to waking up. Such a connection helps dissolve the illusion of separation. In a world that glorifies independence, noble friendship honors interdependence. It recognizes that awakening is not self-centered. It is relational. It unfolds more deeply in connection, where the habits of the self are softened through compassion and truth. These friendships are not without friction, but even conflict becomes practice. You don't walk away because it's hard. You lean in because something larger than comfort is being served. A noble friend doesn't flatter your delusion. They won't let you drift into stories that serve ego. But they also don't shame you. They see your confusion and still believe in your clarity. This kind of companionship brings accountability without control. It helps you track your blind spots. Not because someone is correcting you, but because they live with eyes open. And their presence reminds you to do the same. You begin to want truth more than comfort, not because it's easy, but because it's shared. There's a kind of refuge in this, not escape, not dependency, but a shared field where growth is possible. When practice feels dry, a noble friend rekindles sincerity not by pushing you, but by showing up. They make presence contagious. Their steadiness reminds you that you can return to your breath, even when you've drifted, and you offer the same in return. This is not always through words. Sometimes it's the way you sit together, the silence between you that holds no judgment. The way they don't need you to be better, but they also won't let you be less than who you are. That balance of love and truth, of closeness and clarity is what gives this friendship its power. It doesn't cling, it doesn't possess, it liberates. In times of despair, a noble friend doesn't give you answers. They hold your suffering with you. They remind you that even this pain can be met with awareness. They don't try to speed up your process. They honor it. They trust your unfolding, even when you don't. And that trust heals. Because so much of the inner wound is the belief that no one sees us fully and stays. Noble friendship disproves that. It says, I see you and I'm still here. That presence becomes a living teaching. More than any book, more than any concept, it is the Dharma embodied. This also changes how you show up for others. You stop trying to fix people. You stop needing to be the one with answers. You become more available, not to perform wisdom, but to be real. To be quiet when needed. To listen deeply. To reflect gently. To serve not from ego, but from presence. Over time, the field of noble friendship expands. It's not just one person. It becomes a way of relating. You start to recognize the qualities of Kalyana Mittata in others and in yourself. You seek less for companionship based on validation and more for shared integrity. You find others who value truth more than comfort, who meet their fear with honesty, who turn their insight into action. And, together, something beautiful forms not a community built on performance, but a sangha grounded in sincerity. That sangha might be 2 people, or 10, or just moments scattered across time. It's not about quantity, it's about quality. It's about showing up for each other with full presence and soft ego. It's about being mirrors, not projections. Refuge, not escape. This kind of friendship doesn't guarantee easy progress. It guarantees deeper seeing. And deeper seeing is what leads to freedom. Because in the end, what we most need is not to be taught, but to be seen, to be known, and to be reminded of the clarity we keep forgetting is already within us. Noble friendship does that. It calls us home. It keeps us honest. And in its quiet, unwavering presence it awakens. When presence is shared through noble friendship, something remarkable starts to unfold. A deeper stability takes root, not built on self-assurance, but on trust in awareness itself. You begin to see more clearly, not just during waking life, but in the spaces that surround it. Not just in thoughts or conversations, but in sleep, in death, and in the subtle moments in between. You realize the mind does not disappear when the body rests. It continues, and what you do with those unseen hours matters. Tibetan Buddhism recognizes sleep and dream as more than biological functions. They are fields of practice. They are entry points into the Bardoth transitional states between life, death, and rebirth. And training the mind within dreams, through a practice known as Milam or dream yoga, is not fantasy, it is preparation, not only for death, but for awakening. This training begins by recognizing that sleep does not end consciousness, it changes its shape. In dreams, the usual rules loosen. The mind becomes more flexible, the habits are more obvious. Reactions are quicker, but so is transformation. Because there's less density, the potential for awareness is greater if you can remember to stay present. Lucid dreaming is not a goal in itself. It is a tool. It teaches the mind to recognize illusion as illusion. When you realize you are dreaming, something profound happens. You see that what appeared solid is not. You wake up within the dream, not outside it. And that experience mirrors the deeper path waking up within life, not waiting for something after. In Tibetan tradition, this skill is trained carefully. It begins with intention. Before sleep, you set the mind. You remind yourself, I will recognize the dream. You review your day and identify dreamlike moments. You start to question experience gently, not with suspicion, but with curiosity. Is this real? Becomes a mantra not of doubt, but of awareness. The more this habit takes root, the thinner the veil becomes. Dreams start to shift. You catch yourself mid-scene and remember, this is not waking life. And in that moment, you gain choice. You are no longer swept away by the dream. You become the witness, the participant, the transformer. This has profound implications, not just because dreams can be reshaped, but because emotions can be met differently. Fear arises in a dream, and instead of running, you stay, you examine it, you respond. You practice compassion in the face of danger. You test forgiveness, not just as a theory, but in real time. These trainings imprint the mind. The deeper purpose is not control, it is freedom. The more you train in the dream state, the more you prepare for the moment of death, when the body dissolves and the mind enters the bardo. That in-between space is said to be filled with projections, intense lights, sounds, and forms. Without training, these can be overwhelming. The consciousness grasps. It panics. It clings to identity, and that grasping shapes what comes next. But with practice, the mind recognizes. This too is a projection. The practitioner remembers even there, this is mind, this is movement. I do not need to fear. That recognition is liberation. It's not about escaping the bardo, it's about waking up inside it. And in that waking, choice becomes possible. Dream yoga is not separate from daytime practice. The clarity cultivated in meditation strengthens awareness in dreams. The mindfulness brought to walking, eating, listening it, all carries over. Every moment of presence strengthens the thread, and that thread becomes the bridge between waking and sleeping, between life and death. The Tibetan view does not stop with personal benefit. Lucid dreaming is also a path of compassion. In the dream state, you can visualize helping others, you can send healing, you can practice generosity. These actions leave impressions in the mind stream. They shape intention. They deepen the quality of your presence when you return to waking life. Because ultimately, dream and waking are not two different realities. They are two expressions of the same mind. What makes them different is your level of attachment. In waking life, the illusion is thicker. The consequences feel heavier, but the fundamental truth is the same. Form is fluid, identity is constructed, experience is impermanent. Training in Milam reveals this directly, not through belief, but through experience. You come to see the unreliability of appearances, and instead of becoming cynical, you become kind. When you know everything is dreamlike, you stop clinging, you stop fearing, You become more able to respond with clarity and compassion. This path requires discipline. It is not about escaping into fantasy. It demands honesty, stability, and the courage to see even the uncomfortable dreams clearly. Because just like in waking life, dreams will show you your attachments. They will reveal your fears. And this is not a mistake, it is material for practice. Over time, a deeper shift occurs. You stop dividing your life into sacred and ordinary, real and unreal. You see that training the mind is possible everywhere, in meditation, in conversation, in grief, in joy, in sleep, in death. Every moment becomes workable. Every state becomes a mirror. Milam is not about control. It is about presence, about learning to meet each moment, even the strange and shifting ones, with clarity. About remembering yourself not as the character in the dream, but as the awareness in which all dreams arise. And when this recognition deepens, you carry it everywhere. Waking life becomes more spacious, emotions become more transparent, death becomes less frightening, and dreams, once forgotten or dismissed, become teachers, not as entertainment but as invitations to return, again and again, to the only thing that does not come and go: awareness. Awake within the dream, awake within the world, awake within yourself. After learning to navigate the space between sleep and death with lucid awareness, something gentler begins to emerge, less sharp, less defined, but no less powerful. A quality not grounded in effort or control, but in a quiet, unwavering depth. A presence that does not demand recognition, yet transforms everything it touches. What arises next is not another technique or form. It is a return to balance. In Buddhist tradition, this balance is often spoken of through the union of two forces: method and wisdom, compassion and clarity, form and emptiness. While method often appears in masculine form embodied in action, structure, movement, it is wisdom that represents the feminine, not gendered in a human sense, but energetically, symbolically, and spiritually. It is prajna, the deep, intuitive knowing that sees through illusion, not by dissecting it, but by dissolving the need for separation. The feminine principle in Buddhism has often been overlooked, not because it is absent, but because it is subtle. It doesn't demand. It waits. It reveals itself in silence, in the openness that allows truth to arise without force. It is the spaciousness in which insight lands, the stillness that receives without resistance. And in the path toward awakening, it is not secondary, it is essential. Prajna is not a concept. It is not the kind of knowledge that accumulates. It is the direct recognition of reality as it is, beyond perception, beyond thought. It is the moment the mind stops grasping and begins to listen. In Mahayana and Vajrayana traditions, this wisdom is personified as the goddess Prajna Paramitathe, mother of all Buddhas. Not because she gives birth biologically, but because all enlightened qualities arise from her nature, from emptiness, from the ground of being that does not divide or name. This principle challenges the usual ideas of power. Power, in conventional terms, is about direction, dominance, action. But the feminine principle introduces a different kind of strength. The strength to yield without collapsing, the ability to hold without controlling, the capacity to allow without becoming passive. It is not submission, it is surrender to reality, not as defeat, but as trust. That trust is not blind, it is fierce. It allows what is real to emerge, not what is expected. It does not mold insight, it listens for it. It does not chase attainment, it waits for ripening. This is why, in many tantric texts, the union of wisdom and method is visualized as a male deity joined with a female consort, not as symbolism of sexuality, but as a map of inner integration. Without wisdom, method becomes rigid. Without method, wisdom floats unanchored. Together they awaken. This also reshapes how we view progress. In traditions conditioned by goal setting and linear advancement, the path can become another form of control. But prajna reminds us that awakening is not achieved. It is uncovered. The feminine principle is not a tool to get somewhere, it is the field in which everything becomes visible. In that field, the sharp edges of ego soften, not because they are attacked, but because they are no longer necessary. In practice, this means listening more, rushing less, noticing what arises when we stop needing to be right, fast, or impressive. It means respecting the body's wisdom, trusting the intelligence of emotion, giving space to intuition that doesn't come with data, but with resonance. It means knowing when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to let silence carry the truth better than words ever could. The feminine principle is often misunderstood as weakness, especially in systems built around domination. But in Buddhism, this principle is the deepest form of clarity. It doesn't dominate delusion. It reveals it. It doesn't force realization. It invites it. And it does so not with urgency, but with infinite patience. That patience is not inactivity. It is confidence that truth cannot be rushed, that insight cannot be scheduled, that the deepest transformations do not come from force, but from allowing space for what was hidden to emerge naturally. This kind of strength is harder to see because it does not perform. It doesn't seek recognition. It holds everything without needing to be the center. It is the backdrop against which all forms arise. In this way, it mirrors the nature of emptiness itself. Emptiness is not nihilism. It is the potential for anything to be born. It is the womb of all experience and the resting place of all grasping. The more one practices, the more this quality becomes familiar. It shows up in the gaps between thoughts, in the breath that doesn't need to be manipulated, in the gaze that doesn't judge. It appears in the courage to stay present with discomfort without fixing it, in the maturity that lets go of control and meets life with open hands. This also influences how we relate to others. The feminine principle encourages inclusion, not division, dialogue, not dominance, care, not conquest. It holds space for multiple truths. It values relationship over hierarchy. It listens longer before speaking. It allows the heart to guide, not just the intellect. And this changes how Dharma is shared. Teaching becomes less about instruction, more about transmission. Presence speaks louder than method. Listening becomes more transformative than explaining. Teachers who embody this principle often feel less like authorities and more like companions. They don't lead with certainty. They walk with you through uncertainty. The reverence for this principle is found in many places throughout Buddhist texts, even when not named directly. The Buddha called wisdom the highest perfection. He called it the mother of liberation. In the Heart Sutra, we hear that form is emptiness, and emptiness is form. This is not theory. It is the voice of prajna, speaking across centuries, telling us that what we cling to is not fixed, that what we fear may be the doorway to freedom, that what we seek has always been here quiet, receptive, waiting. As practitioners, cultivating this means softening the need to know and strengthening the ability to rest in not knowing. It means making room for depth instead of display. It means turning away from power over and returning to power with, not abandoning structure, but no longer being ruled by it. This is especially important now. In a time of noise, urgency, and surface-level performance, the feminine principle offers refuge, not in escape, but in depth, not in fragility, but in rootedness. It asks us to pause, to listen, to allow what is true to rise without shaping it too quickly. It's not a rejection of the active path, it is the balancing of it. It is the resting in ground before stepping into action. It is the knowing that comes before words, the holding that makes growth possible. And it reminds us that liberation is not a race. It is a return, a remembering, a release. Strength here is measured by presence. Wisdom here is silent before it speaks. Awakening here is not a trophy but a dissolving into what was always holding us. As the feminine principle invites us to soften, to listen, and to return to a more integrated way of being, it also reveals something else: how far we have drifted from that center in the world we live in every day. Not in temples or retreats, but in the space where most of us now spend countless hours, the digital realm. While our practice may begin in silence, our habits often end in noise. And the digital world fast, reactive anonymousis, where the teachings of non-harm are needed most. Ahimsa, the principle of non-violence, is not just about refraining from physical harm. It is about cultivating a way of being that avoids causing suffering in thought, word, and deed. It is as much about restraint as it is about intention. In the digital age, where communication is instant and attention is currency, practicing ahimsa takes on new urgency and complexity. Online spaces are saturated with judgment. Opinions dominate, nuance fades, and the speed of response often outweighs the depth of reflection. What might begin as curiosity quickly devolves into argument. What starts as expression often becomes performance. This environment challenges mindfulness, not because technology is inherently harmful, but because our conditioning adapts to its pace and values. To practice non-harm here means resisting the pull toward aggression disguised as righteousness. It means recognizing when a comment, even if factually correct, is delivered with the intent to belittle. It means stepping back when the desire to correct is driven by ego rather than care. The first layer of harm in digital life is verbal violence as sarcasm, mockery, dismissiveness. These are often normalized online, but they leave marks. They contribute to a culture of fear and reactivity, not of learning. Non-harm also applies to what we consume. In the attention economy, every click is a vote. What we engage with, we amplify. What we share, we normalize. Scrolling past cruelty without awareness can reinforce harm passively. Practicing digital ahimsa means being selective about what you absorb, not to avoid discomfort, but to stay rooted in integrity. It means choosing silence over outrage bait, not out of indifference, but to preserve inner clarity. Another layer of harm comes through comparison. Social media platforms are built to highlight curated lives, to reward appearance over presence. This causes quiet suffering. Feelings of inadequacy, jealousy, and self-judgment thrive in these environments. Non-harm here means being honest with yourself about what you can handle. It means setting boundaries around time and content. It means unfollowing what distorts your self-worth and not feeding into cycles of projection. But ahimsa is not just avoidance. It's an active presence. It asks you to bring compassion into spaces that reward aggression, to listen without reacting, to respond without needing to dominate. This might mean pausing before posting, reading a comment twice before replying, asking whether your words serve understanding or simply feed division. It also includes recognizing your digital power. Whether you have a small or large following, every post shapes perception. Every message creates a ripple. Practicing non-harm means using this power responsibly, elevating voices that are silenced, sharing truth with humility, avoiding language that exploits fear or division for attention. Non-harm in digital life also means caring for your own nervous system. Endless exposure to negativity numbs the heart. Constant stimulation fractures attention. Practicing compassion includes protecting your capacity to stay present. This might mean scheduling screen-free periods, turning off notifications. Practicing mindfulness while online, noticing when anxiety rises or distraction takes over. Digital ahimsa extends to community. Creating or participating in spaces where people can engage without fear of humiliation is an ethical act. It requires active cultivation, setting norms of respect, guiding conversations back to curiosity, removing content that causes harm even when it is popular. Silence is not always peace. Sometimes, ethical speech includes intervening with kindness, especially when others are harmed. The practice also means recognizing digital disconnection. While we may interact with avatars, usernames, and screens, we are always speaking to real minds, real hearts. The illusion of anonymity distorts empathy. Practicing non-harm means remembering that behind every profile is a person with struggles, with longing, with blind spots, just like you. This recognition brings the practice of metta into every comment, every message, every debate. Digital life often rewards extremes. Outrage spreads faster than nuance. Certainty is admired more than inquiry. But ahimsa invites something different. A soft strength. The ability to speak truthfully without attack. The courage to stay human in a system that rewards performance over presence. It's not easy, but it is possible, and every small act matters. Even choosing not to respond to provocation can be a practice in restraint. Not every argument needs a counter. Not every falsehood needs your energy. Sometimes the most ethical action is to step away, not in silence, but in conscious disengagement. This protects your clarity. It keeps your attention aligned with your values. Ahimsa in digital life also includes the content we create. Are we reinforcing stereotypes? Are we selling certainty we don't have? Are we speaking to be seen or to serve? These questions matter. Integrity online is no different than in person. It requires watching the motives behind expression. The more we bring awareness into this space, the more our use of technology transforms. It becomes less about self and more about service, less about noise and more about connection. The screen becomes not a wall, but a window if we treat it with care. Practicing non-harm online doesn't mean being passive. It means being skillful, choosing timing, tone, and intention with as much care as words. It means being willing to not respond immediately, letting insight settle before speaking, being okay with not having the last word. And when mistakes happen, as they will, non-harm includes repair, owning the impact of your words, apologizing without defensiveness, making space for others to be heard. Digital ethics is not perfection. It is presence. It is learning to show up with clarity in a world that thrives on confusion. Over time, this becomes second nature. You begin to notice what causes harm, not just to others, but to your own peace. You notice what opens the heart and what tightens it. And in that noticing, the path becomes clear. Digital spaces don't have to be sources of suffering. They can become fields of practice, places where compassion is tested and refined, where wisdom is quietly offered in the middle of chaos, where awareness, even in short bursts, becomes a balm in a world moving too fast. Non-harm is not the absence of conflict. It is the presence of care. In the pause before posting, in the breath before responding, in the choice to hold humanity above being right. This is the practice. Here, now, even on a screen. As awareness sharpens in the digital world, where the temptation to speak without care and consume without pause is constant, you begin to recognize a different kind of hunger for quiet. Not just silence in sound, but silence from reaction, from input, from performance. In a world that rewards constant visibility and connection, the soul begins to long for retreat. Not escape, but refuge. Not disconnection, but reconnection with what is simple and real. Solitude is not absence, it is presence made visible. It is the deliberate act of stepping away, not to reject the world, but to see it more clearly. In Buddhist traditions, solitude has long been considered a key condition for insight. Not because people are a problem, but because inner clarity needs space to deepen. When the eyes and ears are constantly filled, the mind becomes too loud to listen inward. And without that listening, awakening becomes theory rather than reality. Monastic life is built around this understanding. Simplicity is not decoration, it's structure. Silence is not emptiness, it's opportunity. Time alone becomes time with the deepest parts of the self, which are not personal, but universal. But solitude is not only for monasteries. In modern life, even surrounded by crowds and noise, the spirit can still retreat if it is intentional. Retreat doesn't require mountains. It requires commitment. A choice to create space where space is rarely given. To wake early and sit without distraction. To walk slowly while the city rushes. To protect small windows of quiet like sacred ground. These acts, when practiced consistently, begin to mimic the environment that supports deep transformation. Urban chaos is not a barrier. It is the condition in which solitude becomes even more meaningful. In noise, quiet reveals its depth. In movement, stillness becomes powerful. You are not waiting for a perfect moment. You are choosing it here, exactly as it is. This choice begins with boundaries. Saying no to unnecessary conversations, putting your phone on silent, turning down an invitation not out of avoidance, but devotion to something deeper. These small decisions build a structure. That structure becomes a container for awareness to expand. Solitude, practiced well, does not isolate. It purifies connection. It gives space for your emotions to be felt without editing, for thoughts to rise without interruption, for the heart to open without needing to perform. It is in solitude that the stories you've absorbed can be heard and then released. This is not easy at first. The mind will resist. It will reach for stimulation. It will replay conversations, rehearse opinions, crave updates. This is withdrawal from a deeper addiction, the habit of external orientation. Solitude strips that away, and in the stripping, truth begins to appear. You start to notice what you miss and why. You see the cravings hidden under distraction. You feel the loneliness you didn't know you were carrying, but you also feel moments of calm you thought were gone. Stillness returns not as a concept, but as an experience. Insight doesn't always shout, it often whispers, and only solitude is quiet enough to hear it. This is how solitude becomes spiritual technology. It doesn't replace the world. It reveals how deeply entangled we are with it. It shows us our patterns without blame. It reveals our attachments without judgment. It becomes a mirror that reflects the mind as it is not as we wish it to be. In that mirror, there is discomfort, but there is also honesty, and with honesty comes the freedom to change. You begin to recognize which thoughts are habitual and which come from clarity, which desires are driven by fear and which are rooted in alignment. This discernment cannot be taught, it is cultivated through direct experience. Solitude also deepens compassion. When the noise of comparison fades, you begin to feel others more clearly. You see that most people are suffering not because of what they lack, but because of how distracted they are from themselves. You stop judging, you start understanding. Solitude makes room for empathy not as an idea, but as a natural response to seeing suffering with a quiet heart. The structure of solitude can take many forms: a morning ritual, an evening walk, a full day of silence once a week, a few minutes of breath before speaking. What matters is consistency and sincerity. Solitude must be held not as punishment, but as nourishment, not as separation, but as sacred return. It is important to remember that solitude does not always feel peaceful. Sometimes it confronts you with everything you've avoided. The body holds memories. The breath uncovers grief. The silence brings back what noise pushed away. But this is not a problem. It is healing, not through fixing, but through facing. Over time, the inner landscape begins to shift. The mind softens, the breath deepens. Presence becomes easier to touch. You stop needing to explain yourself. You stop rushing to fill every moment. You learn to sit with what is, and what is becomes enough. Even brief periods of solitude, if held with attention, can shift your life. You bring that presence back into the world. You listen more, react less, speak with clarity, act with intention. You become less entangled, more responsive, less drained, more aligned. This is not detachment, it is engagement from wholeness. Solitude fills what distraction drains. It gives back what the world often takes. And the more you return to it, the more you begin to carry it with you. Even in a meeting, even on the train, even in conflict, the stillness remains. Solitude is not about being alone. It is about remembering who you are without roles, without input, without performance. It is the gateway to authenticity. It is the space in which the Dharma breathes fully. And when solitude becomes part of your life, not as a luxury, but as a discipline, you stop waiting to feel centered. You return to it again and again. And in that return, something quiet grows. Steady, deep, true. As solitude deepens and begins to reshape how you meet the world, you may notice something else shifting, not just in your schedule or your thoughts, but in the quality of your relationships, your work, your emotions. The space you've created doesn't make you distant, it makes you more awake. But at some point, the mind begins to question, how can I stay so open and still be free? How can I love, serve, feel, and give without losing my center? This is where one of the most misunderstood teachings in Buddhist practice appears with full force: non-attachment. It sounds like detachment. It often gets confused with coldness or withdrawal. But these are not the same. In fact, they point in opposite directions. Detachment is closing. It is armor. It is stepping back so nothing can touch you. Non-attachment is opening. It is presence without grasping. It is letting life in, fully, while no longer needing it to confirm who you are. This distinction changes everything. Because when people hear, let go, they often hear, stop caring. When they're told to not cling, they sometimes interpret it as don't feel. But true practice asks something far more courageous. Not numbing, not repressing, but staying close to experience with the wisdom that nothing can be held forever. This is non-attachment, the ability to stay in contact without control. You can hold someone's hand without squeezing it. You can enjoy beauty without needing to possess it. You can love deeply, even passionately, while knowing that everything, every moment, every person, every feeling will pass. This isn't apathy, it's intimacy. Intimacy with reality. Not the fantasy that things will stay, but the truth that they won't, and loving them anyway. Detachment, on the other hand, is a reaction to pain. It's the habit of turning away to avoid being hurt. It protects through distance. But that protection comes at a cost. It numbs the joy along with the sorrow. It silences love to keep away loss. And in doing so, It cuts off the very qualities that make awakening real: compassion, tenderness, vulnerability. Non-attachment doesn't require you to feel less. It teaches you to feel wisely. You're not asked to abandon people or pleasures. You're invited to see clearly how clinging to them leads to suffering. That insight doesn't push you away. It teaches you how to stay without grasping, how to receive without demanding. To practice this, you must first notice the pull, the subtle tightening in the chest when you want something to last, the ache of disappointment when a feeling fades, the resistance when someone you care about changes or pulls away. These are not signs of failure. They are the places where practice begins. Non-attachment doesn't mean you ignore these reactions. It means you meet them with full awareness, without letting them decide how you respond. You feel the grief, but you don't collapse into it. You notice the desire, but you don't obey it. You hear the inner voice saying, "I need this to be okay," and you gently question it. Do I? That inquiry brings freedom, because you start to see that needing something is not the same as loving it, that clinging to a version of someone is not the same as seeing them, that holding on tightly is not strength, it is fear. The irony is that when you stop clinging, your love becomes more real. It's no longer about getting something. It becomes a gift, not a trade. You don't love because of what someone gives you. You love because your heart is open, and when they go, or change, or disappoint you, you feel it, but it doesn't destroy you, because you weren't depending on them to define your worth. Non-attachment allows you to engage without losing balance. You can show up fully, speak honestly, risk being vulnerable without needing the outcome to go your way. This frees your actions. You give because giving matters, not because you expect a return. You help because suffering is real, not because it makes you look spiritual. This also transforms how you relate to the past. Detachment often represses memory. It tries to forget. But non-attachment allows you to remember without being bound. You can hold pain without being crushed by it. You can honor loss without staying trapped in mourning. You move forward not to escape, but to continue opening to life. The same applies to desire. Detachment kills desire out of fear, but non-attachment honors it while not letting it rule you. You can want things: joy, rest, connection, but you don't make your peace depend on them. If they come, you receive. If they go, you release. Your happiness is no longer at the mercy of conditions. Non-attachment is also key to working with anger, fear, and sadness. These emotions are not denied. They are allowed, fully. But they are not used as weapons. They are not used to define who you are. You can say, "I feel angry," without saying, "I am anger." You can let the wave move through without riding it into harm. In the deepest sense, non-attachment is freedom from identity. You stop needing to be seen a certain way. You stop needing your thoughts to be right, your emotions to be justified, your history to be repeated. You stop clinging to your story as who you are, and you begin to discover who you are when the story quiets. That self is not detached. It is alive. It moves with the moment. It listens. It responds. It does not withhold love out of fear. It does not cling to pleasure out of lack. It flows. Practicing this doesn't mean you become neutral or indifferent. It means you begin to embody balance. You start to feel the ground of your being under every joy, every sorrow. You become less reactive and more responsive. You don't rush to fix everything, but you don't ignore what matters. This balance is not cold. It is full of care. It allows you to be strong without being hard, soft without being weak, present without being overwhelmed. It's a middle way, just as the Buddha taught. Neither indulgence nor suppression, neither clinging nor avoidance. And over time, this becomes your way of being, a kind of inner spaciousness that meets life with open hands. You start to hold everything more lightly, not because it matters less, but because it matters more. You stop wasting time trying to make things permanent. You spend your energy being present while they're here. This shift touches everything. Your relationships become less tense. Your work becomes less self-referential. Your path becomes less about achieving and more about unfolding. And through it all, you begin to feel more peace, not because life is easier, but because you're no longer fighting its impermanence. This is non-attachment, not distant, but deeply here, fully human, and completely free. Once non-attachment becomes a living experience rather than a concept, the inner ground begins to feel steadier. You're no longer clinging, no longer pushing away, just open, clear, and intimate with the present. And in that space, without striving, without expectation, something can happen that changes everything. A moment so immediate, so cutting through, that no part of you remains untouched. A crack opens in the ordinary. The self disappears. Time dissolves. Awareness stands alone. This is Satori. Sudden awakening is not fantasy. It's not some abstract promise in distant scriptures. It is real, and it can happen to anyone, often without warning. In Zen, this moment is known as Kensho, seeing into one's true nature. It's not the final destination. It's a glimpse, a clear, undeniable insight that the self you thought you were has never existed in the way you believed. And yet, the moment is not the transformation, it is the opening. Satori may arrive during meditation, while walking, in silence, in pain, or even in laughter. It is beyond effort, but also impossible without preparation. The mind needs to be quiet enough, the body still enough, the heart honest enough, and when the right conditions meet, the illusion breaks. In that break, the experience can be profound. There may be a sense of returning to something more familiar than anything ever known, an overwhelming peace, a clarity so complete that questions vanish. Or perhaps a shocking emptiness, no anchor, no reference, just pure awareness. Every person experiences it differently, but what unites them is the recognition. Nothing was ever separate. This experience changes you, but it also passes. And this is where the real work begins. Because after the opening fades, the structure of the self begins to rebuild itself. Thoughts return, old habits reappear, conditioning resumes, and many are left confused. Was it real? Did I make it up? Why doesn't it stay? The ego tries to claim the experience as an achievement. The mind wants to recreate it. But awakening cannot be possessed. It can only be integrated. Integration is the process of returning to life while carrying the insight forward, not as memory, but as embodiment. It means allowing what was seen in Satori to inform how you move, speak, relate, and serve, without turning it into a story, without clinging to its intensity, without needing it to define you. Many people struggle here. The experience may be denied or inflated. Some chase the next breakthrough, confusing peak moments for freedom. Others isolate, unable to communicate what they've seen. But Satori is not a destination, it is a beginning, and without integration, its potential fades. Integration begins with humility, a willingness to accept that the insight was clear, but the mind is still conditioned. The glimpse showed you the truth, but habits didn't disappear overnight. There is still work to do, still ego to see through, still reactions to meet with compassion. It also requires grounding. The body needs care, relationships need attention. Life continues, and every part of it becomes the field of practice. There's a temptation to dismiss the world as illusion, but this is another trap. What you saw in Satori is not that life doesn't matter, it's that it doesn't exist the way you thought it did. That's not dismissal. That's clarity. Grounding also means accepting that you are not special. Many people experience awakening. It doesn't make you above anyone. If anything, it makes you more accountable, more responsible for how you show up. Because now you've seen that there's no one to protect. And yet, love remains. That love is what carries the experience into daily life. Another part of integration is discernment. Learning not to speak of the experience too soon. Not because it should be hidden, but because it must be protected. Insight is fragile when fresh. Turning it into teaching or sharing it for validation weakens its impact. Let it settle first. Let it move through you until it becomes natural. Support can also help. A teacher who understands. A sangha that doesn't idolize you. Friends who help you stay grounded in presence, not performance. Noble companionship becomes vital here, not to explain the moment, but to keep you rooted in truth as you digest it. There may also be confusion as paradoxes begin to show up. You know nothing is separate, yet the world appears as dual. You've seen emptiness, yet you still feel pain. You've seen through the self, yet the voice in your head continues. These contradictions are not mistakes. They are the tension where insight deepens, where realization moves from head to heart to body. Sometimes there's grief. Grief that what was seen can't be held. Grief that others may not understand. Even grief for the loss of the old identity. Allow it. The heart is making room for a life without false security. That loss is not a step back. It's integration in progress. One of the greatest gifts of Satori is that it dissolves the search. You stop needing to become something. You've seen that what you are is already whole. The path becomes less about seeking and more about embodying. Less about arriving and more about returning to now, again and again. But don't mistake this for complacency. Insight needs action. The mind still needs training. Compassion must be practiced. Ethics must be lived. Awakening is not the end of effort, it's the end of grasping. Practice continues, but now it comes from love, not lack. And this practice includes falling asleep again. Moments of contraction will still come. The ego will reappear. That's normal. The difference is, now you see it. And in that seeing, you don't need to believe it. You meet the contraction with space. And slowly, the insight begins to stay not as a state, but as a knowing. Eventually, the need to talk about Satori fades. It becomes less important to describe what happened. What matters more is how you love, how you listen, how you walk through the world without needing it to complete you. Because awakening is not what you feel in a peak moment. It's what you carry after. In your words, in your choices, in your silence. That's when insight becomes transformation. That's when Satori becomes real. And now, after more than 3 hours of turning inward, you're not just ready to sleep, you're resting in something deeper. You've walked through emptiness, sat beside death, felt the pull of desire, and seen through the masks of identity. You've explored anger that heals, silence that speaks, love that doesn't cling, and wisdom that doesn't shout. You've learned that awakening doesn't mean escaping life, it means showing up to it, completely present and unattached. These teachings aren't meant to be memorized. They're meant to be lived, slowly, gently, one breath, one moment, one decision at a time. Whether you're lying down in stillness or moving through the chaos of your days, may this journey continue to echo softly in your awareness. May it ground you, soften you, and guide you back again and again to what is already whole. Now, if even one part of this journey moved you, gave you peace, or helped you see something more clearly, leave a comment below with the words, "I'm still here," because that simple truth, spoken with presence, holds the power of a lifetime of practice. And if you want to keep walking this path together, Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell. There are more teachings waiting. Until then, breathe gently, rest deeply, and stay awake even as you sleep.